Welcome, guardian of parallel worlds, to a journey through the shattered mirrors of heroism, where the man of steel's heart turned to iron and justice became tyranny. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of a universe where a single moment of unimaginable loss transformed Earth's greatest protector into its most feared ruler. Let the weight of tragedy and the whispers of what might have been carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace the 5-year descent from hope to despair. Close your eyes, dreamer of better worlds, and witness how even the mightiest can fall. In the beginning, there existed a world so perfect it seemed almost too beautiful to be real, a shining example of what the universe could become when heroes walked among mortals, not as distant gods, but as beloved protectors and friends. This was an Earth where the daily newspaper carried stories of hope rather than despair, where children looked to the skies not in fear but in wonder, where the greatest concerns of ordinary citizens were mundane worries about traffic and weather rather than existential dread about cosmic threats or megalomaniacal schemes. In the gleaming towers of Metropolis, Lois Lane carried within her womb the promise of tomorrow, a child who would bridge the gap between two worlds, born of the love between Earth's greatest reporter and the last son of Krypton. The nursery had been prepared with care that bordered on reverence, painted in soft yellows and greens to welcome whatever blessing the universe would bestow upon them. Superman had spent countless nights floating outside the window of their apartment, listening with superhuman hearing to the tiny heartbeat that represented everything he had never dared to dream possible. The friendship between Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne had reached depths that neither man had imagined achievable in their younger, more guarded years. Gone were the tensions and philosophical disagreements that had once created distance between them, replaced instead by the kind of mutual respect and genuine affection that comes only when two people have saved each other's lives so many times that keeping score becomes meaningless. They had learned to laugh together, to share their fears and hopes without the masks that defined their nocturnal identities. On the rooftop where our tale truly begins, these two titans of justice sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the metropolis skyline in shades of gold and amber. The weight of their respective missions seemed lighter when shared, the burden of protecting the innocent distributed across shoulders broad enough to carry the hopes of an entire world. It was here, in this moment of perfect tranquility, that Superman turned to his dearest friend with words that would forever haunt the memories of those who survived what was to come. The invitation to serve as godfather to the unborn child was offered with the kind of vulnerability that Clark Kent reserved for only the most precious moments of his existence. Behind the simple request lay years of trust carefully cultivated, countless shared battles that had forged bonds stronger than the steel of Superman's flesh, and the profound recognition that Bruce Wayne, for all his darkness and brooding intensity, possessed a moral compass as unwavering as any that had ever guided a hero's path. Batman's surprise at the honor was genuine and deeply moving, a crack in the stoic facade that he maintained even among allies. The detective who could unravel the most complex mysteries found himself momentarily speechless in the face of such trust, such faith in his capacity for nurturing rather than merely protecting. His smile, rare as sunlight breaking through Gotham's perpetual clouds, illuminated features that the world knew only in shadow and shadow. Yet even as these two champions of justice shared this moment of perfect happiness, the seeds of catastrophe were already being planted in the twisted imagination of a madman whose very existence served as a reminder that some forms of evil transcend understanding or redemption. In the darkest corners of Arkham Asylum, where sanity went to die and hope withered like flowers deprived of sunlight, the Joker was crafting the most elaborate and devastating joke in his career of orchestrated chaos. The clown prince of crime had grown weary of his endless dance with Batman, tired of the predictable rhythm of escape, crime, capture, and confinement that had defined their relationship for so many years. His brilliant and diseased mind had conceived of something far more ambitious than mere bank robbery or municipal terrorism, a scheme so perfectly calibrated to cause maximum psychological damage that it would make all his previous atrocities seem like practice rounds for the main event. The death of Jimmy Olsen came without warning or apparent motive, a seemingly random act of violence that served as the opening note in a symphony of destruction that would crescendo in unimaginable tragedy. The young photographer, whose infectious optimism and unwavering loyalty had made him beloved by everyone at the Daily Planet, fell to the Joker's gun with a smile still frozen on his lips, never understanding why his kindness and enthusiasm had been rewarded with sudden darkness. The kidnapping of Lois Lane followed with clinical precision, executed with the kind of meticulous planning that the Joker employed only when his schemes transcended mere chaos to become art. She was taken not through brute force or elaborate trap, but through the exploitation of her most admirable quality, her inability to ignore a story that needed telling or a person who needed help. The false lead that drew her into danger was crafted with psychological sophistication that would have impressed criminal masterminds far more traditionally intelligent than the giggling psychopath who authored it. Superman's panic upon discovering her disappearance was a thing both terrible and heartbreaking to witness. The composure that he maintained through cosmic crises and world-threatening emergencies cracking like glass under the weight of personal terror. His superhuman senses, capable of detecting whispers from orbit or tracking individual heartbeats across continents, suddenly seemed inadequate when focused on the only heartbeat that truly mattered to him. The fear that gripped him was primal and overwhelming, the helplessness of a being who could move planets yet could not protect the woman who carried his child. The call to Batman was made with hands that shook despite their incredible strength, words that stumbled despite coming from a mind capable of processing information at superhuman speeds. The request for help was unnecessary, for Bruce Wayne was already mobilizing every resource at his disposal before the communication was complete. Understanding without explanation that this was not merely another case but the potential destruction of everything that gave his friend's existence meaning and purpose. The Justice League's response was immediate and comprehensive, every hero available converging on Metropolis with the understanding that Superman's personal crisis was their collective priority. The Flash circled the city in microseconds, his consciousness accelerated to speeds that allowed him to examine every square inch of urban landscape while mere moments passed in normal time. Wonder Woman coordinated aerial searches across multiple altitude levels, her warrior's instincts immediately recognizing the tactical sophistication of the threat they faced. The discovery of the Scarecrow's corpse in the laboratories of Star Labs provided the first clue to the true scope of the Joker's scheme. Though none who found the body could have imagined the horrific elegance of the plan that had required his specialized expertise. The Master of Fear had been murdered after completing his final and most terrible work, a custom blend of terror-inducing chemicals that would transform Superman's greatest strength into the instrument of his complete destruction. The submarine beneath Metropolis Bay was discovered through the kind of methodical detective work that had made Batman a legend among law enforcement agencies worldwide. Yet even his brilliant deductive abilities could not anticipate the cosmic cruelty of what they would find in that underwater chamber. The vessel itself was unremarkable, a standard military surplus craft that could have been acquired through any number of black market channels. Yet its cargo would prove to be more devastating than any nuclear weapon ever conceived. Inside that submerged tomb, the Joker had created a theater for the performance of ultimate evil, a stage set for the systematic destruction of everything that Superman represented and stood for. Lois Lane lay upon an operating table, unconscious but alive, her condition maintained through medical equipment that the Joker had stolen from hospitals throughout the city. The cruel genius of the setup became apparent only when Superman's X-ray vision revealed the nuclear device hidden within Metropolis itself. Its detonation mechanism linked through quantum entanglement technology to the heartbeat of the woman he loved. The fear toxin that filled the submarine's atmosphere had been specially formulated to affect Kryptonian physiology, a breakthrough in biochemistry that the Scarecrow had achieved only through months of experimentation with tissue samples acquired through channels that even the Joker preferred not to contemplate. The gas was invisible, odorless, and designed to create the most specific hallucination possible, transforming Lois Lane's unconscious form into the appearance of Doomsday, the one creature in the universe capable of killing Superman through brute force alone. The moment when the toxin took effect was captured by security cameras that the Joker had installed throughout the submarine, equipment that would later broadcast the tragedy to every screen on Earth as part of his final, posthumous joke. Superman's confusion was evident in the footage, his attempt to understand why Doomsday would appear in such an unlikely location, his desperate need to protect the city from the creature that had once killed him, even as his rational mind struggled to comprehend the tactical impossibility of the situation. The battle that followed was brief and one-sided, for Doomsday, as Superman perceived him, possessed none of the monster's actual resilience or regenerative capabilities. The imaginary creature crumpled under blows that should barely have inconvenienced the real thing, dying with a whimper rather than the cosmic roar that had once marked the end of Superman's first life. Yet even as his fists connected with flesh that his mind interpreted as grey and rocky, some part of Clark Kent's consciousness registered the wrongness of what he was experiencing, the terrible softness of the body that should have been unyielding stone. The ascent into space was undertaken at speeds that transcended human comprehension, Superman's need to protect Metropolis from what he believed to be an imminent nuclear explosion overriding all other considerations. He climbed through layers of atmosphere with the delicacy of someone handling the most precious cargo imaginable, his enhanced senses monitoring every aspect of his burden's condition, while his rational mind remained trapped within the Joker's carefully constructed illusion. It was only when Earth's curvature became visible below them that the fear toxin began to metabolize out of Superman's system, the chemical bonds that had held his perception hostage finally breaking down under the combined assault of his alien physiology and the purifying effect of unfiltered solar radiation. The transition back to reality was not gradual, but instantaneous, like awakening from a nightmare only to discover that the nightmare had been real, and the waking world was far worse than any dream could ever be. The woman floating in the vacuum before him was not the creature of his nightmares, but the love of his life, her reporter's press badge still pinned to a blouse that had been torn during her abduction, her wedding ring catching starlight in a way that made Superman's enhanced vision blur with tears that would freeze instantly in the cosmic cold. The child she carried, their child, was gone with her, 2 heartbeats silenced by hands that had been designed to preserve life, not destroy it. The scream that erupted from Superman's throat was not audible in the vacuum of space, yet it seemed to reverberate through the quantum foam that underlies reality itself. A sound of such profound anguish that sensitive individuals across multiple dimensions would later report having nightmares on that night without understanding why. It was the sound of hope dying, of innocence lost, of a soul being torn in half by the recognition of an action so terrible that no amount of good deeds could ever balance the cosmic scales. Far below, the nuclear device hidden in Metropolis's heart fulfilled its programming, detonating with precisely calculated force in the geographic center of the city that Superman had spent years protecting. The explosion was neither the largest nor the most technically sophisticated in human history, yet its symbolism was perfect in its devastating simplicity. The home of the Daily Planet, the building where Clark Kent had learned to be human and where Lois Lane had taught him to love, vanished in a microsecond of nuclear fire that painted the night sky in shades of orange and red. The Justice League's response to the disaster was immediate and heroic, every available member converging on the destruction site to save as many lives as possible from the aftermath of atomic devastation. The Flash ran through radioactive debris at speeds that allowed him to evacuate thousands of civilians in the time it took their minds to process what was happening to them. Wonder Woman coordinated rescue efforts with the precision of a general commanding armies, her warriors' training applied to the salvation of innocents rather than the defeat of enemies. Yet, even as his colleagues worked tirelessly to minimize the human cost of the Joker's ultimate joke, Superman remained in space, holding the lifeless form of everything he had ever loved, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had been stolen from him. The man who had never known defeat, who had overcome every challenge through the application of hope and determination, found himself faced with a loss so complete that it challenged every assumption he had ever held about justice, mercy, and the fundamental nature of the universe itself. The descent back to Earth was undertaken with the reverence of a funeral procession, Superman's enhanced hearing detecting the prayers and lamentations of survivors far below, while his telescopic vision observed the heroic efforts of his friends to restore order to chaos. Yet none of their noble actions could touch the void that had opened within his chest. The absence where his heart had been replaced by something cold and unyielding that pulsed not with the rhythm of life but with the mechanical precision of a countdown timer measuring the seconds until justice would be served. The transfer of Lois's body to Wonder Woman was conducted without words, for no language in any culture that had ever existed possessed vocabulary adequate to express the magnitude of Superman's grief. Diana accepted the burden with the solemnity that her Amazonian training had taught her to bring to sacred obligations, understanding instinctively that she held not merely the remains of a friend but the last physical connection between Superman and his humanity. The request that she keep them safe was unnecessary, for Wonder Woman would have died before allowing any further harm to come to what remained of the family that the Joker had destroyed. Yet Superman's need to voice the plea spoke to his desperate desire to maintain some semblance of the protective instincts that had once defined every aspect of his existence, even as those same instincts were being transformed into something far darker and more dangerous by the alchemy of unbearable loss. The departure that followed was conducted at velocities that scattered clouds and set the upper atmosphere ablaze with the friction of his passage, Superman's flight path taking him directly toward the only destination that could provide him with the answers his wounded soul demanded. The Gotham City police station had processed countless criminals over the decades of its existence, but none had ever entered its custody under circumstances that would prove as historically significant as those that surrounded the Joker's final arrest. Batman's interrogation of the Clown Prince of Crime was proceeding with methodical precision when the wall of the interrogation room simply ceased to exist, replaced by a hole torn by hands that possessed the power to reshape continental landscapes through the application of focused will. The debris that had once been reinforced concrete and steel fell to the floor like confetti, settling around the feet of a figure whose red eyes burned with the intensity of stellar cores. The table that had separated detective from suspect was swept aside with casual contempt, its destruction serving as punctuation to the entrance of someone who had transcended the normal boundaries of law enforcement to become something that existed beyond the reach of merely human justice. The Joker's reaction to Superman's arrival was characteristically inappropriate, a giggle that transformed into full-throated laughter as he recognized the cosmic perfection of the moment he had orchestrated. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds in objective time, yet those few moments contained within them the destruction of every principle that had guided Superman's existence since his arrival on Earth as an infant refugee from a dying world. The hand that had saved countless lives, that had pulled children from burning buildings and caught falling aircraft with gentle precision, became an instrument of execution as it penetrated the Joker's chest and emerged through his spine in a spray of blood that painted the walls of the interrogation room in patterns that would haunt Batman's dreams for years to come. The clown prince of crime died as he had lived, with a smile frozen on his lips and the satisfaction of knowing that his final joke had been his masterpiece, transforming the greatest hero the world had ever known into something that children would learn to fear rather than admire. His last words, whispered through lips already growing cold, were a simple acknowledgement of success that would echo through history as the moment when hope died and tyranny was born from the ashes of justice. In the aftermath of Superman's transformation from beloved protector to judge and executioner, the world watched in stunned silence as their greatest hero retreated to the crystalline solitude of his fortress, carrying within his alien architecture the weight of grief so profound that it seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around his towering form. The news feeds that had once celebrated his every triumph now spoke in hushed tones of tragedy and loss, their cameras unable to penetrate the Antarctic wasteland where the last son of Krypton wrestled with demons that no amount of physical strength could vanquish. Yet, even as Clark Kent sought isolation in the endless halls of Kryptonian memory, the universe continued its inexorable march toward chaos, wars and conflicts erupting across the globe with the regularity of sunrise. Their perpetrators emboldened by the absence of the red and blue figure who had once served as humanity's ultimate deterrent against international aggression. The Middle East burned with renewed fervor, ancient grudges manifesting in modern weapons while diplomats issued statements of concern that carried all the weight of whispers in hurricanes. It was the sound of children screaming that finally penetrated the walls of Superman's self-imposed exile, their cries carrying across thousands of miles to reach ears that had been designed to hear the heartbeat of sparrows in flight. The innocents caught in crossfire bore no responsibility for the Joker's crimes, held no blame for Lois Lane's death, yet their suffering served as fuel for the transformation that was reshaping Superman's fundamental understanding of his role in the world. The emergence from the fortress was conducted at speeds that left sonic booms trailing across 3 continents, Superman's passage through Earth's atmosphere creating auroras of displaced particles that painted the sky in colors that astronomers would spend decades attempting to explain. His destination was not chosen through careful consideration, but through the simple expedient of following the loudest screams, the most desperate prayers, the locations where hope seemed most thoroughly extinguished by the machinery of human cruelty. The presidential palace that Superman entered without regard for protocol, sovereignty, or diplomatic immunity had been the seat of power for a regime that measured its success in the silence of its opposition rather than the prosperity of its people. The man who ruled from its marble halls had grown comfortable in his absolute authority, surrounded by guards whose loyalty was purchased through fear rather than earned through justice. None of his security measures, sophisticated though they might have been by human standards, proved adequate to delay Superman's arrival by even the span of a single heartbeat. The confrontation between dictator and alien savior was conducted in full view of news cameras that the palace guards had neither the time nor the courage to disable. Their footage broadcast live to a world that had never before witnessed their supposed protector operating with such clinical efficiency. The president's removal from his throne was accomplished without violence, yet the casual ease with which Superman lifted the ruler of millions and carried him through walls designed to withstand military assault spoke to power so absolute that resistance became not merely futile but incomprehensible. The journey to the mass graves was undertaken at walking pace, Superman's enhanced senses cataloguing every detail of the horror that stretched across landscapes that should have been fertile with life rather than rich with the remains of the murdered. The dictator's protests grew weaker with each revelation, his attempts at justification withering under the weight of evidence that even the most sophisticated propaganda could not explain away or transform into noble necessity. The stripping away of the tyrant's ceremonial garments was conducted with the same methodical precision that Superman had once applied to more benevolent rescues, each piece of gold braid and military decoration removed and discarded like the pretenses they had always been. The man who had commanded armies and toppled governments found himself reduced to shivering flesh in underwear that bore cartoon characters more dignified than the leader he had proven himself to be. Wonder Woman's arrival at the scene was motivated not by disagreement with Superman's actions, but by concern for the psychological toll that such direct confrontation with human evil might exact upon someone whose nature had always been fundamentally optimistic about the potential for goodness within mortal hearts. Her warrior's training had taught her to recognize the signs of a soldier processing trauma, and the Superman she observed bore all the hallmarks of someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. The suggestion that Superman addressed the world through official channels rather than continue his ad hoc interventions was practical wisdom born from centuries of Amazonian experience with the delicate balance between divine authority, mortal governance. Diana understood better than most the seductive appeal of solving problems through the application of superior force. Yet she also recognized the dangers inherent in allowing gods to rule over mortals without their consent or understanding. The United Nations Assembly that gathered to hear Superman's first official address since the Metropolis disaster represented every nation and ideology on Earth. Yet the diversity of their political philosophies seemed insignificant when faced with the presence of someone whose power transcended all earthly authority. Diplomats who had spent careers crafting careful compromises and nuanced positions found themselves reduced to the status of children listening to a parent explain the new rules by which the household would operate. The speech that followed was notable not for its eloquence, though Superman's words carried the weight of absolute conviction, but for its complete absence of negotiation or consideration for alternative viewpoints. The man who stood before the assembled representatives of humanity was no longer seeking their approval or cooperation, but simply informing them of decisions that had already been made by a mind that no longer recognized the legitimacy of their authority over matters of life and death. The declaration of a worldwide ceasefire was unprecedented in its scope and absolute in its certainty, delivered by someone whose enforcement capabilities made the threat implicit rather than spoken. Every weapons manufacturer, every military commander, every rebel leader and freedom fighter across the globe understood simultaneously that the rules governing human conflict had been permanently altered by the will of an alien whose patience with their species had reached its absolute limit. The response from the international community was as swift as it was catastrophically misguided, revealing the depth of human arrogance and the dangerous persistence of Cold War thinking in an era that demanded entirely new approaches to the reality of superhuman intervention in global affairs. The decision to kidnap Martha and Jonathan Kent represented not merely a tactical error, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological forces that had reshaped their adopted son into something far more dangerous than any weapon in Bi-Fis. Their arsenals. Mirror Master's involvement in the kidnapping plot demonstrated the willingness of even metahuman criminals to serve governmental interests when the price was adequate to overcome their usual independence. The technology that allowed him to transport Superman's parents into the mirror dimension was sophisticated enough to thwart conventional rescue attempts. Yet, the perpetrators of this scheme had failed to consider that they were dealing with someone whose capabilities transcended conventional understanding of physical law. The burning of the Kent farmhouse served multiple purposes in the psychological warfare being conducted against Superman, destroying not merely a building but the physical anchor to his human identity. The place where Clark Kent had learned the values that had once guided his heroic mission. The flames that consumed the home where he had been raised were fed not merely by accelerants, but by the systematic destruction of every photograph, every memento, every tangible reminder of the childhood that had shaped him into someone capable of protecting rather than ruling. The Justice League's response to this crisis revealed the first cracks in their unity, Philosophical differences that had once been manageable disagreements now expanding into fundamental splits about the proper response to threats against their families and loved ones. Wonder Woman's declaration of solidarity with Superman was based not merely on personal loyalty, but on her Amazonian understanding that attacks against family members demanded responses that transcended normal rules of engagement and diplomatic protocol. Cyborg's decision to stand with Superman represented the triumph of gratitude over principle. His recognition that the alien who had saved the world 10 times over deserved support even when his methods diverged from traditionally heroic approaches. The calculations running through his cybernetic brain had processed every possible outcome and determined that a world under Superman's protection, however authoritarian it might become, was preferable to one where chaos reigned unchecked by superior force. The systematic search for Superman's parents was conducted with the efficiency of a military operation and the desperation of a family seeking lost children. Every member of the League applying their unique abilities to the task of tracking down the perpetrators of this unconscionable escalation. The Flash ran search patterns that covered entire continents in minutes. His consciousness accelerated to speeds that allowed him to examine every possible hiding place while normal time crawled past like molasses. Wonder Woman's interrogation techniques, refined through centuries of Amazonian military tradition, proved remarkably effective when applied to government operatives who had been trained to resist conventional methods but had never faced questioning by a literal goddess whose lasso compelled absolute honesty. The information extracted from these sessions painted a picture of institutional panic and desperation that explained, though it could never excuse, the decision to target Superman's civilian family. The discovery of Batman's involvement in exposing the conspiracy provided a crucial reminder that even in this darkening world, there remained voices of conscience willing to risk everything to prevent the complete abandonment of moral principle. His infiltration of the White House demonstrated capabilities that even his closest allies had never fully appreciated, while his confrontation with the president revealed a moral clarity that remained uncompromised, despite the supernatural pressures reshaping everyone around him. The president's question about whether Batman still considered himself part of a collective heroic identity or had chosen to stand apart from Superman's increasingly authoritarian methods highlighted the fundamental tension that was beginning to tear the superhero community apart. The distinction between them and us represented more than mere semantics, reflecting the emergence of philosophical camps that would soon harden into opposing armies in a conflict that would consume the world. The Justice League's global campaign to end all warfare represented the logical extension of Superman's ceasefire declaration. Yet the methods employed to achieve this noble goal revealed how thoroughly good intentions could be corrupted when filtered through the lens of absolute power. The intervention in Atlantis began as a diplomatic mission, but escalated into military confrontation when Aquaman refused to acknowledge Superman's authority over the sovereign kingdom beneath the waves. Arthur Curry's resistance to Superman's demands was rooted not in hostility to peace, but in the fundamental principle that no surface dweller, regardless of their power, possessed the right to dictate terms to the rulers of the seven seas. His summoning of the Kraken represented both a show of strength and a test of Superman's resolve, a challenge designed to determine whether the self-appointed protector of Earth was willing to risk Atlantean lives to enforce his vision of planetary harmony. The battle that followed was as magnificent as it was terrible. Two kings whose domains had never truly overlapped, suddenly discovering that their spheres of influence were incompatible in ways that could only be resolved through the application of overwhelming force. The Kraken that had once been legend became reality as it rose from depths that had never known sunlight, its tentacles large enough to crush battleships yet still inadequate to match the strength of someone who could move continents when properly motivated. Superman's decision to relocate all of Atlantis to the Sahara Desert represented perhaps the most audacious display of power in recorded history. The literal transportation of an entire civilization from their ancestral home to an environment so hostile that survival became dependent upon the mercy of the one who had displaced them. The engineering challenges alone should have been insurmountable. Yet Superman's alien physiology and determination proved capable of accomplishing what entire civilizations could not have achieved through centuries of coordinated effort. The image of Atlantis rising from the ocean floor like some impossible island in the sky was broadcast to every corner of the world, providing humanity with visual proof that their self-appointed protector possessed capabilities that rendered all previous assumptions about the limits of power utterly obsolete. The displacement of millions of tons of water created tidal effects that were felt on every coastline, while the sight of an entire city being carried through the atmosphere like a toy in the hands of a child demonstrated the futility of conventional resistance to Superman's will. Aquaman's submission in the face of such overwhelming force was pragmatic rather than cowardly, his acceptance of defeat representing the recognition that further resistance would serve only to endanger the lives of subjects whose welfare remained his primary responsibility despite their new circumstances. His message of conditional cooperation, transmitted through Wonder Woman's diplomatic channels, carried the implicit promise that his wisdom and experience remained available to Superman should the Kryptonian ever develop the humility necessary to seek counsel rather than simply impose solutions. The establishment of Atlantis in the Sahara created logistical challenges that required ongoing intervention from Superman to maintain. His daily flights to provide water and adjust atmospheric conditions becoming a routine that demonstrated both his commitment to the welfare of those he had displaced and his assumption of responsibilities that properly belonged to their legitimate ruler. The sight of the last son of Krypton personally attending to the mundane needs of an entire civilization provided a strange counterpoint to his increasingly authoritarian methods, revealing traces of the humanitarian impulses that had once defined his heroic mission. The psychological impact of witnessing an entire kingdom relocated through the will of a single individual reverberated through every government and military organization on Earth, forcing strategic planners to confront scenarios that their training had never prepared them to consider. The question was no longer whether Superman could be stopped through conventional means, for the Atlantis incident had demonstrated the futility of such approaches, but rather how humanity could maintain any semblance of autonomy in a world where one being possessed the power to reshape geography according to his personal vision of justice. The confrontation in the Batcave that followed these global demonstrations of power represented the inevitable collision between two irreconcilable philosophies of heroism, both born from trauma yet evolving in diametrically opposite directions under the pressure of impossible choices and moral complexity. The sacred space that had served as Batman's headquarters for decades became a battleground not just for opposing strategies, but for fundamentally different understandings of what it meant to protect the innocent in a universe where gods walked among mortals. Superman's arrival in the cave was conducted with the casual disregard for security that marked all his recent actions. His ability to penetrate any defense-making concepts like secret identities and hidden sanctuaries seem quaint remnants of an era when heroes operated according to human limitations. The sight of the Kryptonian standing among Batman's carefully preserved trophies and mementos created a jarring juxtaposition between the methodical detective work that had defined Bruce Wayne's approach to crime fighting and the Bay-Maitei overwhelming force that now served as Superman's primary tool for problem solving. Damian Wayne's presence in the cave added layers of complexity to an already fraught situation. His position as both Bruce's son and someone whose worldview had been shaped by training that emphasized results over methods, making him a potential bridge between the opposing camps, yet also a source of additional tension. His gratitude to Superman for eliminating the Joker was genuine and heartfelt, reflecting the perspective of someone who had witnessed the consequences of allowing dangerous criminals to survive and continue their destructive patterns. Nightwing's careful questioning about Superman's condition demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made Dick Grayson an effective leader and mediator. His ability to express concern without immediately triggering defensive responses born from years of experience managing conflicts between strong-willed individuals. His presence served as a reminder of the extended family that Batman had created over the years. The network of allies and protégés whose loyalty had been earned through shared sacrifice and mutual respect rather than demanded through demonstrations of superior force. The revelation of Superman's parents' kidnapping shifted the dynamic of the confrontation from philosophical debate to personal crisis. Batman's immediate recognition of the tactical implications demonstrating the strategic thinking that had made him effective despite his lack of superhuman abilities. His questions about Superman's response revealed both genuine concern for his friend's welfare and growing alarm at the precedent being established through the application of unlimited power to human conflicts. The destruction of Batman's mask represented more than mere property damage, serving as a symbolic stripping away of the barriers that had allowed Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent to maintain their friendship despite their fundamentally different approaches to justice. The casual ease with which Superman removed the cowl that had protected Batman's secret identity for decades demonstrated the obsolescence of such precautions in a world where one being possessed the power to ignore any defense or penetrate any disguise. The philosophical argument that erupted between these former friends encapsulated the central tension that would drive all future conflicts in this transformed world. The question of whether the ends could ever justify the means when those means involved the abandonment of principles that had once been considered inviolable. Superman's defense of his execution of the Joker was based on utilitarian calculations about lives saved versus lives lost, while Batman's opposition stemmed from absolute moral principles that brooked no exceptions regardless of circumstances or consequences. The revelation that Batman had enabled the Joker's continued existence through his refusal to kill provided Superman with ammunition for his argument that traditional heroic methods were inadequate to address the scope of evil that existed in the world. Every life lost to the Joker's subsequent schemes after Batman had captured and released him became evidence for Superman's position that mercy toward the irredeemably wicked was actually cruelty toward their future victims. The physical confrontation that followed this philosophical impasse was brief but devastating in its implications. Batman's punch proving as ineffective against Kryptonian physiology as it was symbolically important as a declaration of continued resistance to Superman's transformation. The complete absence of any physical effect from Bruce's most powerful blow served as a stark reminder of the fundamental inequality that had always existed between them, now stripped of the courtesy and restraint that had once masked it. The alarm systems that interrupted their confrontation served as a deus ex machina that prevented the complete dissolution of their relationship in that moment, providing both men with an external crisis that demanded their immediate attention despite their personal conflicts. The battle with Atlantis had escalated beyond Superman's control, requiring intervention that would test whether any cooperation remained possible between former allies who had chosen such different paths toward the same ultimate goal of protecting the innocent. In the months that followed the cataclysmic destruction of Atlantis, and the irreparable schism between Superman and Batman, the world watched with growing unease as their former protector continued his systematic reorganization of global affairs according to principles that seemed to shift and evolve with each new crisis he chose to address personally. The Justice League, once a beacon of collaborative heroism, had become something resembling a divine court with Superman as its unquestioned sovereign, dispensing justice according to interpretations of law and morality that acknowledged no earthly authority or traditional limitation. The Titans, that brave assemblage of younger heroes who had once represented hope for the future of heroism itself, found themselves confronting the same impossible choices that had torn apart their mentors and role models. Superboy, whose genetic heritage linked him directly to the man who had become Earth's self-appointed ruler, carried within his enhanced physiology not merely the potential for great power, but also the terrible burden of understanding exactly what such power could become when filtered through grief and righteous anger, unchecked by humility or doubt. The day that Metropolis died had also claimed the lives of Kid Flash and Beast Boy, two young heroes whose friendship with Superboy had provided stability and joy in lives already complicated by the burden of extraordinary abilities and the expectations that came with them. Their deaths in the nuclear fire that consumed Superman's adopted city had been mercifully quick. Yet, the psychological impact of their loss reverberated through the surviving Titans with the force of a secondary explosion that continued to claim victims long after the initial catastrophe had passed. Superboy's vigil over Beast Boy's dying form had been witnessed by news cameras that survived the initial blast, their footage providing the world with images of heroic devotion that seemed to belong to an earlier, more innocent era when the greatest tragedies faced by young heroes involved failed romances or disagreements about team leadership rather than genocide and the systematic destruction of everything they had been taught to value and protect. The green-skinned shapeshifter's final transformation had been into the form of a small bird, as if his dying mind had sought to return to something pure and simple that existed beyond the reach of nuclear fire and political machination. The return to Titan's Tower, after the disaster had been conducted in silence that spoke more eloquently than any eulogy could have managed. The surviving members of the team gathering in their familiar meeting room, yet finding themselves unable to look directly at the empty chairs where their fallen comrades should have been sitting. The television that had once provided them with updates about global crises now served as a window into a transformed world where their former idol had become something that inspired fear rather than admiration among the very people he claimed to be protecting. The arrival of Dick Grayson at the tower had been anticipated by none of them. His emergence from the shadows that had claimed him since departing his leadership role, providing a glimmer of hope that adult guidance might help them navigate the moral complexities that suddenly surrounded every aspect of their heroic mission. Yet the news he brought with him was more devastating than any physical blow they might have sustained in battle. The revelation that Superman had crossed the ultimate line and taken a life with his own hands, shattering their fundamental assumptions about the nature of heroism itself. Nightwing's explanation of the Joker's execution was delivered with the clinical detachment of someone who had witnessed too many transformations of good people into something darker and more dangerous. His years of experience with Batman having taught him to recognize the signs of moral corruption, even when they appeared in those he had once considered incorruptible. The tears that streaked down Superboy's face as he processed this information were not merely expressions of grief but acknowledgments of innocence lost, the final destruction of childhood faith in the absolute reliability of those who wore the mantle of protector. The request that Dick Grayson resume leadership of the Titans came naturally from Starfire, whose alien perspective allowed her to see patterns of authority and responsibility that her more human teammates might have missed in their emotional distress. Yet his refusal, based on his obligation to support Batman during what promised to be the most difficult period of his mentor's career, demonstrated the kind of loyalty that had once been common among heroes but was becoming increasingly rare as former allies chose sides in philosophical conflicts that admitted no compromise or middle ground. Superboy's journey to the Fortress of Solitude was undertaken without the knowledge or approval of his teammates, his need to confront Superman about the path he had chosen overriding all considerations of safety or tactical wisdom. The crystalline architecture of Superman's sanctuary had always seemed welcoming to the young clone, a place where his complicated origins could be discussed without judgment and his potential for heroism nurtured by someone who understood the burden of extraordinary power. Yet the fortress he entered bore the scars of its occupant's transformation, its perfect geometries marred by damage inflicted by fists that had learned to destroy rather than create. The confrontation between genetic original and laboratory creation was conducted in the shadow of statues depicting Lois Lane and the child she had carried, monuments to loss that dominated the central chamber, with their silent testimony to the price of the Joker's final joke. Superman's explanation of his actions was delivered with the weary patience of someone who had already repeated the same justifications to himself countless times. Yet the words carried none of the conviction that had once made his speeches inspiring rallying cries for justice and hope. The philosophical argument that erupted between them revealed the generational divide that was reshaping the entire superhero community. Younger heroes clinging to ideals that their elders were abandoning under the pressure of accumulated trauma and bitter experience. Superboy's defense of traditional heroic principles was passionate and heartfelt, yet it carried the naivety of someone who had not yet been forced to choose between competing moral imperatives or witness the consequences of mercy extended to those who would use it as a weapon against the innocent. Superman's response to his clone's moral challenge was not anger, but a terrible sadness that seemed to age his features beyond their chronological years, the weight of decisions and consequences creating lines of care and worry that no amount of alien invulnerability could erase. His question about whether Superboy could continue to wear the symbol that connected them both was not a threat, but a genuine inquiry into the younger hero's capacity for the kind of moral flexibility that survival in an imperfect world seemed to demand. The departure from the fortress was conducted with the ceremonial gravity of a funeral, Superboy's rejection of everything that Superman had become serving as both condemnation and eulogy for the hero who had inspired his creation but could no longer serve as a role model worth emulating. The symbol that had once connected them across the artificial divide between original and copy was removed with hands that shook not from fear but from the magnitude of what that gesture represented, the complete severing of bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. The funeral that followed served multiple purposes beyond the obvious need to honor the dead and provide closure for the grieving, becoming also the venue for Superman's first major public address since the execution of the Joker and his declaration of worldwide authority over matters of war and peace. The gathering of world leaders and ordinary citizens that assembled to pay their respects to the victims of the Metropolis disaster found themselves witness to the articulation of a new world order that would reshape human civilization, according to principles that had never been subject to democratic debate or popular approval. The speech that Superman delivered from the podium erected among the graves of Metropolis was notable not for its eloquence, though his words carried the weight of absolute conviction, but for its complete transformation of traditional heroic rhetoric into something resembling a declaration of divine mandate. The man who had once asked for humanity's trust now simply informed them of decisions that had already been made by a mind that no longer recognized the legitimacy of their input on matters he deemed essential to their survival. The promise of a worldwide ceasefire was presented not as a goal to be achieved through negotiation and compromise, but as a reality that would be imposed through the application of superior force. The detailed threats implicit rather than spoken yet clearly understood by every military commander and political leader in the audience. The transformation of Earth's greatest protector into its unquestioned ruler was accomplished not through conquest or revolution, but through the simple expedient of making resistance seem futile rather than merely inadvisable. Yet even as Superman consolidated his authority over the surface world and its squabbling governments, other forces were beginning to stir in response to the fundamental disruption of cosmic balance that his transformation represented. The Tower of Fate, that nexus of mystical power that existed partially outside normal space and time, had become a refuge for those who possessed the wisdom to recognize that conventional approaches to the Superman problem would prove inadequate to address a crisis that transcended mere politics or military strategy. Dr. Fate, whose consciousness represented the fusion of human wisdom with cosmic understanding accumulated over millennia of existence, had observed the unfolding tragedy with the detached perspective of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations yet retained enough humanity to mourn the loss of potential that Superman's transformation represented. His decision to involve himself directly in earthly affairs was unprecedented in its scope, motivated not by partisan politics but by recognition that the corruption of such a powerful force for good posed threats that extended far beyond any single planet or dimension. The recruitment of allies for what would become known as the Battle for Superman's Soul was conducted with the methodical precision that characterized all of Dr. Fate's endeavors. Each potential participant selected not merely for their power or tactical utility, but for their capacity to contribute unique perspectives to a conflict that would be decided as much through philosophical argument as physical confrontation. The network of mystical practitioners, occult investigators, and supernatural entities that answered his call represented every major tradition of magical knowledge that had ever developed on Earth. John Constantine's involvement in the anti-Superman coalition was perhaps the most surprising element of Dr. Fate's recruitment strategy. Given the Liverpudlian's well-documented history of self-interest and moral flexibility that seemed antithetical to any crusade based on abstract principles of justice and cosmic balance. Yet beneath his cynical exterior and calculated detachment lay genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary human beings who would bear the cost of Superman's transformation from protector to ruler, their freedom and dignity sacrificed on the altar of his grief and righteous anger. The personal motivation that drove Constantine's participation in what promised to be a suicidal mission against the most powerful being on Earth was rooted in his complicated relationship with his daughter Rose, whose existence had been kept secret from everyone except a few trusted allies who understood the unique vulnerabilities that came with being connected to someone whose magical practices attracted the attention of entities that viewed human relationships as potential weapons to be exploited. The threat that Superman's New World Order posed to his ability to protect his child provided all the motivation necessary to overcome his natural reluctance to involve himself in conflicts where survival was unlikely. The magical defenses that surrounded the Tower of Fate were strengthened and reinforced through rituals that drew power from sources both ancient and dangerous. Protective spells woven from techniques that had been developed over centuries of warfare between practitioners whose understanding of cosmic forces allowed them to threaten the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet even these formidable barriers would prove inadequate against an enemy whose power operated according to principles that existed beyond the normal boundaries of magical theory and practice. Zatanna's participation in the mystical coalition brought with it not merely her considerable abilities as a practitioner of backward-spoken magic, but also her unique perspective as someone who had maintained friendships within the superhero community, despite her primary allegiance to the magical realm. Her relationships with members of the Justice League provided intelligence about their psychological states and tactical capabilities that would prove invaluable in planning operations against opponents whose powers and methods were intimately familiar to her. Detective Chimp's inclusion in the group might have seemed absurd to outside observers unfamiliar with his deductive abilities and encyclopedic knowledge of occult phenomena. Yet his contributions to their strategic planning proved as valuable as those of any human participant. His analysis of Superman's behavioral patterns and psychological profile provided insights that complemented the magical approaches favored by his colleagues, creating a comprehensive understanding of their enemy that encompassed both his superhuman capabilities and his all-too-human weaknesses. The arrival of Jason Blood at their clandestine meetings brought with it the promise of access to power that rivaled Superman's own. Yet the demonic nature of that strength created moral complications that forced the Coalition to confront uncomfortable questions about the acceptable limits of their own methods. The demon Etrigan, bound within Blood's human form through ancient curses that predated most of recorded history, possessed the raw power necessary to challenge even Kryptonian might. Yet unleashing such a force carried risks that extended far beyond their immediate tactical situation. The discovery that they were being observed by supernatural forces aligned with Superman's regime came through sources that preferred to remain anonymous, whispers from the Shadow Realm, where information flowed along currents of fear and rumor rather than through conventional intelligence networks. The realization that their enemies possessed their own mystical allies forced a fundamental reassessment of their strategic situation, transforming what had seemed like a clear advantage into a more complex and dangerous form of magical warfare. The revelation that the Spectre himself had been corrupted through means that initially remained unclear to even the most knowledgeable members of their coalition, represented perhaps the most devastating blow to their cause since its Primzams All-Life-Fashion. Inception. The spirit of vengeance, whose cosmic authority derived from sources that transcended any earthly power, should have been the natural enemy of Superman's transformation from protector to dictator. Yet his apparent alliance with the regime suggested that forces beyond their comprehension were reshaping the fundamental nature of divine justice itself. The investigation into the Spectre's corruption was conducted through methods that pushed the boundaries of what even experienced practitioners considered safe or advisable, requiring contact with entities and exploration of realms where human consciousness was not merely unwelcome, but actively threatened by exposure to truths too vast and terrible for mortal minds to process without permanent damage. The discoveries they made in the course of this research would transform their understanding of the conflict they had chosen to join, revealing layers of complexity and cosmic significance that dwarfed their initial assumptions about its scope and implications. The unmasking of Mr. MXYZSCTLK as the true power behind the Spectre's apparent support for Superman's regime explained much that had seemed inexplicable about the supernatural dimensions of their conflict. Yet it also raised new questions about the motivations driving someone whose power existed on a scale that made even Superman seem insignificant by comparison. The fifth-dimensional imp's fascination with the last son of Krypton had been documented in previous encounters, yet his willingness to corrupt fundamental forces of cosmic justice suggested an investment in the outcome that transcended mere entertainment or intellectual curiosity. The Battle of the Tower of Fate, when it finally erupted with the force of colliding realities, represented the convergence of every magical tradition and supernatural power that had ever existed on Earth. Their combined might focused on a conflict whose outcome would determine whether mystical forces would serve as a check on Superman's growing authority or become another tool for enforcing his vision of perfect order. The spells and counterspells that filled the air around the tower created aurora effects that were visible from orbit, their interaction with Earth's magnetic field producing phenomena that would inspire new theories about the relationship between consciousness and cosmic forces. The sacrifice of Jason Blood in the opening moments of the battle served notice that their enemies were prepared to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable in any previous magical conflict. His death by Spectre's sword demonstrating the level of power that had been brought to bear against them. Yet even in dying, the occultist managed to provide his allies with crucial intelligence about the nature of their opponents and the true source of the Spectre's corruption. Information purchased with blood but invaluable for the strategic insights it provided. Detective Chimp's analysis of the battle's progression revealed tactical patterns that suggested their enemies were following a predetermined plan rather than responding spontaneously to their actions. implying a level of foresight and preparation that should have been impossible given the secrecy that had surrounded their coalition's formation. The realization that they had been anticipated and countered before they even began their operations forced a fundamental reassessment of their chances for success and the wisdom of continuing a conflict that seemed designed to end in their complete destruction. Constantine's emergency evacuation of the surviving coalition members was accomplished through teleportation spells that drew power from sources he had sworn never to touch again, bargains with entities whose price would be paid in installments that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The dimensional rifts that carried them to safety left scars on the fabric of reality that would require centuries to heal. Yet the alternative of remaining to face the Spectre's wrath would have guaranteed their immediate and permanent destruction. The revelation that Dick Grayson had been chosen as the new Deadman represented perhaps the only positive development to emerge from the catastrophic battle. His unique combination of detective skills and moral clarity, making him an ideal candidate for powers that allowed him to observe and influence events from beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. The transition from his corporeal existence to his new supernatural state was accomplished with the grace and dignity that had characterized all his previous transformations. Yet the price paid for these abilities was permanent separation from the physical world he had sworn to protect. The message that Deadman carried from the dying Constantine to Batman was delivered with the solemnity appropriate to final communications between old allies. Yet its contents would prove more valuable than any intelligence gathered through conventional means. The warning about the true nature of the forces arrayed against them, the identification of key players whose roles had remained hidden, and the strategic recommendations based on hard-won experience with supernatural warfare would reshape Batman's understanding of the conflict he was attempting to wage against impossible odds. The aftermath of the Tower of Fate battle left the surviving members of the mystical coalition scattered and demoralized, their most powerful artifacts destroyed or corrupted, their traditional sources of power compromised by enemies who had demonstrated superior knowledge of magical theory and practice. Yet the intelligence they had gathered about MixYZPTLK's involvement and the true nature of the Spectre's corruption would prove invaluable to future resistance efforts, providing the foundation for strategies that might succeed where conventional approaches had failed so catastrophically. The transformation of the supernatural realm from potential ally to active enemy marked the end of the second year of Superman's reign and the beginning of a new phase in the conflict that would determine Earth's future. The failure of magical opposition to provide effective resistance to the regime's expansion had eliminated one of the few remaining checks on Superman's power, leaving only human ingenuity and determination to stand against forces that seemed to transcend every natural law and cosmic principle that had once provided stability and predictability to heroic endeavors. The psychological impact of the mystical coalition's defeat reverberated through every remaining resistance cell, forcing those who still opposed Superman's rule to confront the possibility that their cause was not merely difficult, but actually hopeless in any meaningful sense. The realization that even supernatural forces were arrayed against them or neutralized by superior power created despair that threatened to accomplish what direct confrontation had failed to achieve. The complete collapse of organized opposition through the simple expedient of making resistance seem pointless rather than merely dangerous. Yet even in the darkest moments of that terrible year, when hope seemed as extinct as the civilizations that had once challenged cosmic tyranny and lost, there remained those who understood that the true battle was not for immediate victory, but for the preservation of principles and values that might someday inspire future generations to continue the struggle. The seeds of eventual rebellion were planted, not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in quiet moments of moral choice. individual decisions to maintain dignity and compassion despite overwhelming pressure to abandon such luxuries in favor of mere survival. The third year of Superman's reign had witnessed the systematic dismantling of every supernatural force that might have served as a check upon his growing authority. Yet the cosmic balance that governed reality itself would not long tolerate such fundamental disruption of the natural order. In the marble halls of Olympus, where gods who had shaped human civilization since its earliest stirrings now contemplated the emergence of a mortal who claimed divine prerogatives without acknowledging divine wisdom, conversations were taking place that would reshape the relationship between heaven and earth in ways that no prophecy had ever predicted. Zeus, the All-Father whose thunderbolts had once been sufficient to humble any challenger to his supremacy, found himself confronting a situation that transcended his considerable experience with rebellious mortals and uppity heroes. The reports that reached him from the world below spoke of someone whose power rivaled that of the gods themselves, yet who operated according to principles that acknowledged no higher authority, no cosmic hierarchy that had maintained stability across eons of existence. The very existence of such a being represented a challenge to the fundamental order that had governed reality since the Titans fell and the Olympians claimed dominion over both mortal and divine affairs. Ares, the god of war, whose domain encompassed every aspect of conflict from personal vendetta to cosmic struggle, had observed Superman's transformation with the professional interest of someone whose expertise extended to understanding the psychology of warriors driven beyond their normal limitations by grief and loss. His analysis of the situation revealed tactical opportunities that a more conventional deity might have overlooked. The possibility that careful manipulation could transform Earth's self-appointed protector into an instrument for advancing Olympian interests in ways that direct intervention could never achieve. The decision to intervene in mortal affairs was not made lightly, for the Olympians had learned through bitter experience that involvement in human conflicts carried costs that often exceeded any benefits that might be achieved through the exercise of divine power. Yet the precedent that Superman was establishing, the notion that beings of sufficient power could simply ignore the authority of their betters and remake the world according to their personal vision, posed threats to cosmic stability that demanded response regardless of the risks involved. The summoning of Wonder Woman to appear before the divine court was accomplished through methods that acknowledged her unique position as both Olympian champion and member of the Justice League, her divided loyalties creating complications that would require delicate handling if the gods hoped to secure her cooperation rather than her active opposition. The arrival of Princess Diana in the throne room of Zeus was conducted with all the ceremony appropriate to her royal status. Yet the gravity of the situation was communicated through subtle alterations in protocol that spoke to the unprecedented nature of the crisis they faced together. The explanation of Superman's crimes against the natural order was delivered with the measured cadence that Zeus employed when pronouncing judgments that would reshape the destiny of entire civilizations. Each accusation supported by evidence gathered through divine surveillance methods that transcended any mortal understanding of privacy or sovereignty. The systematic violation of free will that characterized Superman's approach to global governance, his assumption of authority that properly belonged to elected leaders and legitimate institutions, his transformation of protection into domination through the application of overwhelming force. Wonder Woman's defense of her teammate and friend was passionate yet carefully reasoned, her warrior's training having taught her to present arguments with the same precision and tactical awareness that she brought to physical combat. Her catalogue of Superman's achievements in protecting Earth from threats that no human institution could have addressed alone, his success in ending wars that had claimed countless innocent lives, his demonstrated commitment to the welfare of those who lacked the power to protect themselves from exploitation and oppression. Yet even as Diana spoke in defense of Superman's methods, her words carried undertones of doubt that revealed her own growing concerns about the path he had chosen and the psychological toll that absolute power was exacting upon someone whose nature had never been designed to carry such burdens. Alone, the Amazon princess, who had been raised to understand the proper relationship between power and responsibility, found herself struggling to reconcile her loyalty to a friend with her awareness that his actions were violating principles that she had been taught to consider sacred and inviolable. The judgment that Zeus pronounced was crafted with the subtle cruelty that characterized divine justice when applied to mortals who had dared to challenge cosmic authority, offering Wonder Woman a choice between competing loyalties that would require her to betray either her teammates or her heritage. The trial by combat that would determine Superman's fate was presented as an ancient tradition that honored both parties while providing a forum for resolving disputes that could not be settled through negotiation or compromise. The selection of Wonder Woman as Olympus's champion created a conflict of interest so profound that it threatened to tear her apart psychologically, forcing her to choose between her duty to her divine family and her commitment to the friends who had stood beside her through countless battles against forces that threatened all existence. The Amazon princess, who had once served as a bridge between the world of mortals and the realm of gods, suddenly found herself transformed into the focal point of a conflict that could end only in tragedy regardless of its outcome. The arena that materialized around the combatants was constructed from materials that existed partially outside normal space-time, its boundaries designed to contain forces that might otherwise have devastated entire continents through their mere interaction. The assembled witnesses to this cosmic trial represented every major power in the universe, their presence serving both to legitimize the proceedings and to ensure that whatever outcome emerged would be accepted by all parties rather than serving as the foundation for future conflicts. The battle between Superman and Wonder Woman represented more than mere combat between former allies, becoming instead a physical manifestation of the philosophical tensions that had been building within the superhero community since the fall of Metropolis and the death of innocence that had followed in its wake. Every blow exchanged carried the weight of competing visions of justice, different understandings of what it meant to protect the innocent in a universe where gods and mortals shared the same reality yet operated according to fundamentally incompatible moral frameworks. Wonder Woman's warrior training had prepared her for combat against opponents whose physical capabilities matched or exceeded her own. Yet, the psychological dimension of fighting against someone she had once considered among her closest friends created vulnerabilities that no amount of tactical preparation could address. The hesitation that marked her initial attacks, the unconscious pulling of punches that should have been delivered with lethal intent, the persistent hope that some word or gesture might restore the Clark Kent she had known and trusted. Superman's approach to the combat was marked by the same clinical efficiency that had characterized all his recent actions, his emotional investment in the outcome subordinated to tactical considerations about the most effective methods for achieving victory against an opponent whose capabilities he knew intimately. Yet beneath his apparent detachment lay currents of pain and regret that occasionally surfaced in moments when Wonder Woman's attacks penetrated his defenses, reminding him of the friendship they had once shared and the future they might have built together under different circumstances. The intervention of Sinestro, at the crucial moment when Wonder Woman had achieved tactical superiority, represented a violation of divine protocol, so flagrant that it shocked even those observers who had expected some form of treachery to emerge during the proceedings. The yellow energy that struck down the Amazon princess carried with it the implicit message that Superman's allies would not allow him to lose regardless of the legitimacy of the proceedings or the cost in terms of cosmic stability and divine authority. Zeus's response to this insult was swift and terrible, his thunderbolts transforming the carefully controlled arena into a battlefield where the fundamental forces that shaped reality clashed with destructive power that threatened to unravel the fabric of existence itself. The escalation from trial by combat to divine warfare represented exactly the kind of cosmic disruption that the proceedings had been designed to prevent. Yet the passions and principles involved proved too powerful to be contained within any civilized framework. The arrival of Superman's regime forces transformed the conflict from a dispute between individuals to a war between competing visions of universal order. Mortal technology and superhuman abilities pitted against divine power and cosmic authority in combinations that had never been tested through actual combat. The very ground beneath their feet began to buckle and tear under the stress of forces that operated according to principles that transcended any single reality or dimensional framework. Apollo's emergence as the primary champion of Olympian interests brought to the battle powers that complemented Zeus's raw strength with the refined precision that came from eons of practice in the application of divine authority to mortal affairs. His mastery of light and energy provided tactical advantages that even Superman's enhanced speed and invulnerability could not entirely overcome, creating openings for divine intervention that might otherwise have been impossible to achieve. The curse that Apollo pronounced upon Superman as their conflict reached its crescendo was designed not merely to cause physical harm but to demonstrate the fundamental futility of mortal resistance to divine will, regardless of how enhanced that mortality might be through alien heritage or technological augmentation. The arrow that pierced Superman's shoulder carried with it energies that operated according to magical principles, bypassing his normal invulnerability through methods that conventional weapons could never employ. Shazam's arrival at the battle represented the convergence of mortal heroism and divine power in forms that complicated the neat categories that had previously defined the conflict between Olympus and the regime. The young man whose abilities derived from the same pantheon that sought to humble Superman found himself caught between competing loyalties. His respect for the gods who had granted him power balanced against his understanding of Superman's motivations and methods. The battle between Shazam and Hercules showcased the difference between divine power granted to mortals and divine power wielded by its natural possessors. Their conflict serving as a microcosm of the larger war between different understandings of how supernatural abilities should be employed in service of justice and order. The thunderclaps that marked each exchange of blows created atmospheric disturbances that were felt across multiple continents, their sound carrying implications that transcended mere noise to become declarations of war between heaven and earth. Superman's tactical decision to sacrifice Hercules through the application of overwhelming kinetic force demonstrated his willingness to escalate beyond any limits that divine protocol might have established. His use of planetary re-entry velocities as a weapon representing the kind of creative application of physics that gods whose power operated through more traditional channels found difficult to counter effectively. The death of a son of Zeus carried symbolic weight that transformed the conflict from a legal proceeding to a blood feud that would admit no resolution short of total victory for one side or the other. The emergence of Harley Quinn as an unexpected factor in the divine warfare provided comic relief that seemed inappropriate given the cosmic stakes involved. Yet her irreverent approach to gods and monsters alike served as a reminder that mortal perspectives on divine conflicts often differed dramatically from the views held by the participants themselves. Her apparent death while protecting Billy Batson created emotional stakes that transcended the abstract principles that had originally motivated the various combatants. The journey through the underworld that followed Harley's sacrifice revealed aspects of divine justice and cosmic order that were normally hidden from mortal understanding. The bureaucratic machinery that processed souls and assigned eternal destinations operating according to principles that seemed simultaneously more and less fair than any earthly legal system. The presence of Wonder Woman's mother among the imprisoned added personal stakes that transformed Diana's participation from duty to desperation. Poseidon's intervention represented the expansion of divine conflict beyond the original scope that Zeus had envisioned, His control over Earth's oceans providing tactical capabilities that could devastate human civilization regardless of Superman's ability to protect specific locations or individuals. The wall of water that threatened to drown Themyscira served as both weapon and symbol, demonstrating the helplessness of mortals when gods chose to employ their full power without regard for collateral damage or innocent casualties. The alliance between Aquaman and Poseidon created temporary tactical advantages for the resistance against divine authority. Yet the fundamental incompatibility between mortal and divine approaches to conflict resolution ensured that such cooperation could be neither permanent nor entirely successful. The death of Arthur Curry while defending his people against divine wrath provided the resistance with a martyr whose sacrifice would inspire future generations, while simultaneously demonstrating the ultimate futility of opposing cosmic forces through conventional heroic methods. The revelation of Ares' double agency explained much that had seemed inexplicable about the escalation and intensity of the divine conflict, his manipulation of both sides serving personal agenda that transcended loyalty to either Olympus or the regime. The god of war's understanding of conflict dynamics had allowed him to orchestrate events in ways that maximized destruction and chaos, while positioning himself to benefit from whatever outcome eventually emerged from the cosmic struggle. The truth about Darkseid's involvement in the divine war represented the expansion of the conflict beyond any boundaries that either mortal or Olympian participants had originally contemplated. The Lord of Apocalypse using the distraction provided by their battle to advance his own agenda for universal conquest and domination. The alliance between Ares and Darkseid revealed layers of complexity and cosmic significance that dwarfed the initial disagreement between Superman and Zeus. Superman's journey to Apocalypse to confront Darkseid directly demonstrated his willingness to escalate beyond any limits that had previously constrained heroic behavior. His invasion of the enemy's stronghold, representing the kind of preemptive warfare that his former allies would have found morally unacceptable. The battle between these two titans of destruction was conducted on a scale that threatened the stability of Apocalypse itself, their conflict generating energies that rivaled the output of entire star systems. The intervention of the new gods in the cosmic conflict represented the involvement of forces whose perspective transcended both mortal and Olympian concerns, their authority deriving from sources that operated according to principles that neither side fully understood. The Highfather's decision to impose resolution through superior power demonstrated that even gods could be subject to authority that exceeded their own. Hierarchy, extending upward through levels of existence that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The withdrawal of the Olympians from Earth marked the end of divine involvement in mortal affairs while simultaneously establishing Superman's authority as legitimate in ways that no earthly institution could challenge or revoke. The recognition of his rule by cosmic forces that had once seemed beyond his reach provided validation for methods that had previously seemed questionable, transforming dictatorship into divinely sanctioned governance. The final confrontation between Superman and the world's remaining nuclear powers represented the consolidation of his authority over the most destructive weapons that human civilization had ever developed. His demonstration of superior force serving as the foundation for a new world order based on the absolute prohibition of mass destruction technologies. The systematic elimination of nuclear arsenals was accomplished not through negotiation or treaty, but through the simple expedient of making their continued existence impossible rather than merely inadvisable. The psychological impact of witnessing gods humbled by mortal power reverberated through every remaining institution that had once provided structure and meaning to human civilization, forcing a fundamental reassessment of humanity's place in a universe where traditional hierarchies had been overturned through the application of superior will and overwhelming force. The age of heroes seeking divine approval or cosmic validation had ended, replaced by an era in which power justified itself through results rather than legitimacy derived from higher authority. Yet, even as Superman's victory over both earthly and divine opposition seemed complete, the seeds of future resistance were being planted in the minds of those who understood that true authority derived not from power alone but from the consent of the governed and the voluntary submission to principles that transcended individual will. The silence that followed the gods' withdrawal was not the peace of acceptance, but the quiet that precedes the storm, pregnant with possibilities that neither victor nor vanquished could entirely predict or control. The transformation of Earth from a world where heroes served humanity into a planet where humanity served its self-appointed protector was accomplished not through conquest or revolution, but through the systematic elimination of alternatives, leaving those who cherished freedom with choices that seemed designed to break their spirits rather than test their resolve. The fourth year of Superman's reign would prove that even gods could be wrong about the fundamental nature of power and the sources from which legitimate authority ultimately derived. The fifth year of Superman's reign began with the deceptive tranquility that often precedes the most devastating storms, a period when the surface calm of his New World Order masked the growing tensions and accumulated resentments that would soon explode into conflicts more destructive than any that had preceded them. The systematic elimination of nuclear weapons had been accomplished with the clinical efficiency that now characterized all of Superman's interventions in global affairs. Yet the very completeness of his victory over humanity's most dangerous toys had created new forms of desperation among those who still remembered what freedom felt like before it became a luxury that the world could no longer afford. In the depths of the ocean where conventional surveillance methods could not penetrate, the regime's underwater prison had been constructed according to specifications that prioritized absolute security over humanitarian concerns. Its designers understanding that the inmates it would house possessed capabilities that rendered traditional containment methods not merely inadequate but laughably primitive. The facility that stretched across the abyssal plains like some monstrous cathedral of incarceration represented the culmination of years of research into the specific vulnerabilities and requirements necessary to hold beings whose powers had once made them the equals of gods. The arrival of Plastic Man at the prison's perimeter was conducted with the casual confidence of someone whose unique physiology allowed him to navigate environments that would prove instantly lethal to any normal human being. His molecular structure adapted to pressures that would crush conventional submarines like empty tin cans. Yet the motivation that drove Patrick O'Brien to undertake such a dangerous mission was not professional obligation or abstract principle, but the most fundamental force in human psychology. A parent's love for a child whose only crime had been inheriting his father's unconventional abilities and independent spirit. The shapeshifter, known as Luke, had been captured during one of the regime's increasingly efficient sweeps for individuals whose powers or connections made them potential threats to the stability of Superman's new world. Order, his youth and obvious inexperience failing to protect him from a system that had learned to err on the side of caution when evaluating risks to planetary security. The cell that held him was a masterpiece of engineering, designed specifically to contain beings whose molecular structure existed in states of constant flux, its walls constructed from materials that adapted their properties in real time to counter any attempt at escape. Plastic Man's infiltration of the prison complex required the application of abilities that he had spent decades refining through both heroic missions and less noble pursuits. His capacity for molecular manipulation, allowing him to assume forms that existed at the very boundaries of what physics would permit. The transformation into living liquid that could flow through microscopic gaps in the facility's construction was accomplished through techniques that pushed his powers to their absolute limits. Each cell in his body restructured according to principles that would have seemed like magic to observers unfamiliar with the true scope of metahuman potential. The disguise as a prison guard was maintained through constant conscious effort that required a level of concentration that normal humans could sustain for only brief periods. Yet Plastic Man's decades of experience with covert operations had taught him the mental disciplines necessary to maintain complex impersonations, even under the stress of immediate danger. His knowledge of the facility's layout and security protocols had been acquired through methods that the regime's intelligence services had not anticipated. Connections within the criminal underworld providing information that official channels would never have revealed. The cafeteria where he first encountered Kilowog served as a nexus of despair and defiance, the various inmates representing a cross-section of everyone who had ever opposed Superman's vision of perfect order through the application of superior force. The Green Lantern, whose ring had once channeled the will of the universe itself, now found himself reduced to mundane concerns about nutrition and exercise. His cosmic authority stripped away by enemies who understood that the most effective prisons were those that made escape seem pointless rather than merely difficult. Kilowog's response to Plastic Man's recruitment offer was characterized by the same stoic pragmatism that had made him an effective trainer of young lanterns during the Corps' glory days. His willingness to participate in what would obviously be a suicidal mission based not on hope for success, but on recognition that even futile gestures retained meaning when they were conducted according to principles that transcended immediate self-interest. The prison riot that followed his provocation of Bane was conducted with the precision of a military operation disguised as spontaneous violence. The liberation of the superpowered inmates required careful coordination between Plastic Man's infiltration abilities and the raw strength provided by beings whose capabilities had been temporarily suppressed but never eliminated. Their restraints, designed by engineers who understood their powers in theory but lacked the practical experience necessary to anticipate every possible countermeasure. The cache of Green Lantern rings that Plastic Man had acquired represented perhaps the most dangerous contraband that had ever been smuggled into a maximum security facility. The death of Kilowog at Sinestro's hands served as a brutal reminder that the regime's forces possessed both the power and the will to employ lethal force against opponents whose only crime had been refusing to acknowledge Superman's authority over their consciences and actions. The yellow energy that pierced the veteran Lantern's chest carried with it the implicit message that mercy was a luxury that could no longer be afforded in a world where opposition to established order was treated as treason against a police. The fundamental principles of civilization itself. The sacrifice that Plastic Man made to ensure the escape of his fellow inmates was conducted with the matter-of-fact heroism that had characterized his entire career. His willingness to stretch his molecular structure beyond its normal limitations, serving as both tactical necessity and moral statement about the obligations that parents bore toward their children. The gradual tearing of his cellular matrix under the pressure of containing an entire ocean was accompanied by the kind of physical agony that would have killed normal humans through shock alone. Luke's desperate attempt to convince his father to abandon the other escapees and save himself revealed the depth of understanding that existed between them, despite the years of separation that Plastic Man's lifestyle had necessitated. Their relationship complicated by responsibilities and dangers that conventional families never had to navigate. The younger shapeshifter's accusation about his father's preference for dramatic martyrdom over mundane parental obligations carried the sting of truth that made it impossible to dismiss as mere childish resentment. The escape through Mirror Master's dimensional portals was accomplished in the final seconds before Plastic Man's molecular cohesion would have failed completely. His survival dependent upon timing so precise that even a moment's hesitation would have condemned him to dissolution into component atoms scattered across several cubic miles of ocean floor. The mirror dimension that served as their temporary refuge operated according to physical laws that were similar enough to normal reality to sustain human life, yet different enough to confound the tracking methods that the regime employed. to monitor escaped prisoners. The alliance between heroes and villains that emerged from their shared imprisonment was based not on friendship or mutual respect, but on the pragmatic recognition that Superman's new world order posed threats to their independence that transcended their traditional philosophical differences. The criminals who had once terrorized innocent civilians found themselves aligned with the very heroes who had captured them, their common cause rooted in resistance to a form of authority that neither group could accept without abandoning the fundamental principles that defined their identities. The address that Plastic Man delivered to his unlikely coalition of allies was notable for its complete absence of moral posturing or appeals to abstract justice, focusing instead on the practical benefits that could be achieved through coordinating their various illegal activities against targets connected to the regime's infrastructure. The suggestion that they concentrate their criminal energies on making Superman's life difficult represented a revolutionary approach to superhero-villain relations that acknowledged the changed nature of their world while maintaining some connection to traditional patterns of conflict and cooperation. The dispersal of the freed inmates across the globe created immediate challenges for the regime's security apparatus, their various hideouts and criminal enterprises serving as focal points for resistance activities that were difficult to distinguish from ordinary lawlessness. The multiplication of threats across dozens of locations simultaneously forced Superman and his allies to spread their attention and resources in ways that reduced their effectiveness while providing opportunities for more coordinated opposition efforts. The recruitment of the rogues represented Batman's attempt to exploit the rigid moral codes that govern certain categories of criminal behavior, their principled refusal to kill innocent civilians making them more reliable allies than many heroes whose commitment to non-violence had been compromised by years of escalating conflict with the regime. The irony that villains had proven more trustworthy than heroes was not lost on anyone involved in the resistance, yet practical necessity trumped philosophical consistency when the stakes involved the future of human freedom. The Flash's growing doubts about the regime's methods had been accumulating since the early days of Superman's transformation. Yet his loyalty to his friend and his genuine belief in the noble intentions behind even the most questionable actions had prevented him from acting on his concerns until the evidence of systematic brutality became impossible to ignore or rationalize. The speed that had once made him Superman's most effective enforcer now became a liability that forced him to witness atrocities at a level of detail that slower observers were mercifully spared. The philosophical discussions between Superman and the Flash were conducted at velocities that compressed hours of debate into subjectively normal conversations. Their exchange of ideas accelerated to match Barry Allen's enhanced cognitive processes while maintaining the careful reasoning that such complex moral questions demanded. The chess game that served as backdrop for their dialogue provided a metaphor for the strategic thinking that Superman claimed guided his transformation of global civilization. Yet, the moves on the board revealed assumptions about human nature that the Flash found increasingly disturbing. The slippery slope argument that Superman presented with such logical precision demonstrated how easily noble intentions could be used to justify increasingly authoritarian measures, each step in the progression seeming reasonable when viewed in isolation, yet combining to create a totalitarian system that bore no resemblance to the democratic ideals that had originally motivated their heroic mission. The Flash's inability to identify the precise moment when protection had become oppression illustrated the insidious nature of tyranny that emerged gradually rather than through sudden revolution. The realization that Lex Luthor had been developing the super-strength pills in secret represented both a practical problem for the regime's military capabilities and a symbolic challenge to Superman's authority over the Saya technological infrastructure that sustained his new world order. The industrialist's decision to sabotage his own production facilities demonstrated the kind of calculated betrayal that required years of careful planning and the willingness to sacrifice immediate benefits for long-term strategic advantages. Damian Wayne's return to the Batcave after months of service with the regime created emotional complications that neither he nor his father were prepared to handle effectively, their relationship having been strained beyond any easy repair by choices that had placed them on opposite sides of conflicts that admitted no middle ground or compromise solutions. The young man's consumption of the strength-enhancing pills represented more than mere tactical preparation, serving also as a symbolic rejection of the limitations that his human heritage had imposed upon his ability to contribute meaningfully to conflicts between beings of godlike power. Alfred Pennyworth's injury during Damian's uncontrolled demonstration of his enhanced abilities served as a brutal reminder that power without wisdom was dangerous, regardless of the nobility of intentions that might guide its application. The veteran butler's decades of service to the Wayne family, providing no protection against forces that operated beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The sight of his oldest friend lying broken amid the wreckage of Batman's trophy collection provided Damian with a visceral understanding of why restraint and discipline were essential components of any meaningful heroism. The revelation that Hawkgirl had been replaced by Martian Manhunter in disguise explained many of the intelligence failures that had plagued Batman's operations over the previous months, the shapeshifter's telepathic abilities allowing him to gather information about resistance plans while simultaneously feeding false intelligence back to the regime. The discovery of this deception forced a complete reassessment of every operation that had been conducted with Hawkgirl's apparent participation. The possibility that their most sensitive secrets had been compromised, requiring immediate changes to protocols and procedures that had been developed over years of careful planning. Superman's decision to reveal Batman's secret identity to the world represented an escalation in their personal conflict that transcended any tactical considerations about the effectiveness of such exposure. The violation of privacy serving primarily as punishment for Bruce Wayne's refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of his former friend's authority. The social media campaign that spread the revelation across every connected device on Earth demonstrated the regime's mastery of information warfare and their willingness to employ any weapon that might prove effective in breaking their opponent's will to resist. The confrontation at Wayne Manor that followed Batman's exposure was conducted with the theatrical flair that characterized so many of their encounters. Yet the underlying desperation on both sides revealed how thoroughly their relationship had been poisoned by choices that neither could undo or forgive. The assembled forces of the Justice League that surrounded the manor served as both military necessity and symbolic statement about the isolation that Batman had chosen through his continued opposition to the New World Order. Wonder Woman's ultimatum to Batman represented the final attempt by someone who had once considered him a valued ally to provide him with an opportunity for surrender that might preserve his life while ending his effectiveness as a PES. Resistance leader, her warrior's training had taught her to respect courage, even in enemies. Yet her loyalty to Superman made it impossible for her to allow personal sentiment to interfere with strategic necessities that transcended individual relationships. The battle that erupted around Wayne Manor was notable not for its scale, which was modest compared to the cosmic conflicts that had characterized the previous year, but for its intimate and personal nature. Former friends and allies finding themselves forced to employ their most devastating abilities against people they had once trusted with their lives. The sight of Martian Manhunter being pulled from his disguise and revealed in his true form provided a moment of tactical advantage that Batman's forces were prepared to exploit despite the moral complexity of attacking someone whose infiltration had been motivated by genuinely humanitarian concerns. The death of Martian Manhunter at Wonder Woman's hands served as perhaps the most shocking moment in a conflict that had already claimed numerous casualties. The Amazon princess's decision to employ lethal force against someone who had been attempting to facilitate peaceful resolution, demonstrating how thoroughly the rules of engagement had changed since the early days of heroic cooperation. The Martian's final words about tyranny and the destruction of worlds carried prophetic weight that would resonate through all subsequent developments in their escalating war. Superman's response to his friend's death revealed the extent to which his capacity for forgiveness had been eroded by years of opposition and betrayal. His heat vision attack on Wonder Woman serving both tactical and emotional purposes that could not be separated through rational analysis. The fact that she survived only because of her divine heritage provided no comfort to observers who understood that her Amazon constitution was far more resilient than any protection available to ordinary mortals who might find themselves targeted by similar attacks. The escape of Batman's forces through the mirror portals represented a temporary tactical victory that could not disguise the strategic reality of their increasingly desperate situation. Their ability to strike at regime targets balanced against the growing effectiveness of Superman's countermeasures and the gradual erosion of safe havens where resistance operations could be planned and conducted. The loss of Wayne Manor, as both symbol and practical base of operations, marked the end of an era in Batman's war against injustice. The revelation that even the most carefully planned operations were subject to intelligence compromises that could turn allies into enemies and sanctuaries into traps forced a fundamental reassessment of resistance strategy. The traditional methods of superhero cooperation having been rendered obsolete by opponents who possessed capabilities that transcended conventional understanding of surveillance and infiltration. The war that had begun as a conflict between competing philosophies of justice had evolved into something resembling the spy novels that Bruce Wayne had read as a child, yet with stakes that encompassed the future of human civilization itself. The psychological toll that these defeats exacted upon both sides was evident in the increasing brutality and personal nature of their attacks upon each other. Former friends now employing intimate knowledge of weaknesses and vulnerabilities that had once been shared in trust and confidence. The transformation of personal relationships into military intelligence created wounds that would require generations to heal. Assuming that any possibility for reconciliation survived the conflicts that seemed destined to consume everyone involved in their inexorable progression towards some form of final resolution. The weight of accumulated defeats and moral compromises had transformed the final year of the great conflict between Superman and Batman from a philosophical disagreement into something resembling a blood feud, each side having suffered losses so profound that the original principles motivating their opposition seemed like distant memories from a more innocent time. The systematic destruction of every safe haven, the corruption of every alliance, and the revelation that even their most trusted companions could become instruments of betrayal had stripped away the last vestiges of nobility from what had once been conceived as a war to save the soul of heroism itself. The underground network that Barbara Gordon had constructed from the ruins of her father's law enforcement career represented perhaps the most sophisticated resistance operation in human history. Yet its very existence served as a monument to how thoroughly the normal structures of justice and democratic governance had failed to contain a threat that operated beyond any constitutional framework or legal precedent. The young woman whose spine had been shattered by the Joker's bullet years earlier had learned to transform physical limitation into strategic advantage. Her forced immobility, allowing her to develop analytical capabilities that surpassed even Batman's legendary detective skills. Oracle's monitoring systems had evolved far beyond their original purpose of providing tactical intelligence for individual missions, becoming instead a comprehensive surveillance network that tracked every significant development in the global conflict between order and freedom. The screens that surrounded her wheelchair displayed a world in constant flux, governments falling and rising according to Superman's whims. Entire populations relocated when their presence conflicted with his vision of optimal resource distribution. resistance cells forming and dissolving with the regularity of weather patterns. The intelligence reports that flowed through Oracle's systems painted a picture of systematic oppression disguised as benevolent governance, Superman's regime having perfected techniques for controlling human behavior that made traditional tyranny seem crude and inefficient by comparison. The elimination of privacy through ubiquitous surveillance, the conditioning of children to report signs of dissent among their parents and teachers, the gradual replacement of elected officials with appointed administrators whose loyalty was guaranteed through methods that transcended mere political agreement. Batgirl's return to active duty represented more than mere personal triumph over physical adversity, serving also as a symbol of resistance to those who believed that Superman's victory was inevitable and opposition futile. The experimental procedures that had restored function to her damaged spine incorporated alien technology that Lex Luthor had provided through channels so secret that even Oracle's extensive network had been unable to trace their origins. The possibility that their benefactor might be playing a deeper game than any of them suspected, adding layers of paranoia to relationships already strained by years of betrayal and disappointment. The partnership between Barbara Gordon and Kate Kane had been forged through shared loss and common purpose, their complementary skills creating operational capabilities that neither could have achieved independently. Batwoman's military training provided tactical expertise that balanced Oracle's strategic intelligence, while her willingness to employ methods that Batman had always considered unacceptable offered options for dealing with enemies whose own moral constraints had long since been abandoned in service of what they considered higher purposes. The recruitment of Catwoman back into active resistance work required careful negotiation that acknowledged both her legitimate concerns about personal safety and her complex relationship with Bruce Wayne, whose psychological state had deteriorated markedly since the loss of Wayne Manor and the exposure of his secret identity. Selina Kyle's decision to rejoin the fight was motivated less by abstract principle than by recognition that Superman's new world order posed existential threats to the kind of independence and freedom that defined her essential bias. Nature. The death of Renee Montoya had served as a brutal reminder that heroism and good intentions provided no protection against enemies who possessed the power and will to employ lethal force against anyone who challenged their authority. Her overdose on strength-enhancing pills, transforming a moment of righteous anger into a tragedy that accomplished nothing except adding another name to the growing list of casualties that both sides used to justify escalating brutality. The sight of her body lying broken in the wreckage of the Washington Monument provided visual testimony to the futility of individual heroism against systematic oppression. Batman's presence at Montoya's death scene had been carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous. His emergence from hiding, designed to test Superman's response to a situation that offered opportunities for both reconciliation and further escalation. The conversation that followed revealed how thoroughly their relationship had been poisoned by accumulated grievances and incompatible worldviews. Yet it also demonstrated that some capacity for communication still existed between them despite the ocean of blood and betrayal that separated their current positions. The promise that their war was over carried all the weight of exhaustion and genuine grief, yet it also concealed strategic considerations that neither man could acknowledge openly without compromising operations that were already in motion. Batman's apparent surrender was accepted by Superman with the wariness of someone who had learned through bitter experience that his oldest friend was capable of deceptions so sophisticated that even Kryptonian senses could not detect their presence until it was too late to prevent their implementation. The return to Batman's hidden base was conducted with the solemnity of a funeral procession. The surviving members of the Resistance gathering to witness what appeared to be the formal end of their leader's involvement in a cause that had consumed 5 years of their lives and claimed the lives of countless friends and Heavenbows F2 allies. Yet beneath the surface of apparent defeat lay preparations for the most desperate gambit in the history of human resistance to tyranny. A plan so audacious in its scope and implications that its success would require the cooperation of forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The revelation of Lex Luthor's true loyalties provided the final piece of intelligence necessary to understand how Superman's regime had managed to anticipate and counter so many resistance operations. The industrialist's position within the inner circle of power, providing him with access to strategic planning and tactical intelligence that had made effective opposition nearly impossible to sustain. Yet his decision to serve as a double agent rather than a simple collaborator suggested motivations that transcended mere self-preservation, his actions guided by principles that remained opaque even to those who benefited from his assistance. The clone technology that Lex had been developing in secret represented perhaps the most dangerous research project in human history, its implications extending far beyond the immediate tactical advantages that a duplicate Superman might provide to encompass fundamental questions about identity, consciousness, and the nature of moral responsibility. The possibility that synthetic beings might possess souls equivalent to those of their organic counterparts created philosophical dilemmas that neither science nor religion had adequately prepared humanity to address. The bizarre Superman, whose existence had been kept hidden from all but the most trusted members of the Resistance, served as both hope and horror, his reversed moral reasoning making him as dangerous to innocent civilians as any villain yet created by accident or design. The tragic comedy of his interactions with Trickster revealed the fundamental instability that characterized all attempts to replicate consciousness through artificial means. The subtle flaws in his personality matrix creating behavioral patterns that were simultaneously endearing and terrifying. The murder of the weather-controlling criminal known as Trickster marked the moment when Bizarro's defective moral programming transformed him from tragic figure to genuine threat. His inability to understand the permanence of death leading to actions that would have been considered atrocities if committed by someone whose mental capacity was not so obviously impaired. The skeletal remains that Superman discovered at the scene of their final encounter provided stark evidence of what happened when godlike power was wielded by a mind incapable of comprehending the consequences of its choices. The investigation into Bizarro's origins forced Superman to confront uncomfortable truths about the loyalty of his closest allies. Lex Luthor's involvement in the creation of an imperfect duplicate revealing layers of deception and manipulation that called into question every aspect of their relationship since the fall of Metropolis. The possibility that other secrets remained hidden, other betrayals yet to be discovered, added paranoia to a psychological profile already warped by grief and the gradual erosion of trust in anyone or anything beyond his own judgment. The death of Alfred Pennyworth represented perhaps the most devastating blow struck by either side during the entire conflict. The murder of an elderly servant whose only crime had been loyalty to his employer, demonstrating that Superman's New World Order recognized no boundaries of age, innocence, or non-combatant status when dealing with those who opposed its expansion. The clinical efficiency with which Victor Zsasz had carried out the assassination provided evidence of planning and coordination that transformed a personal tragedy into a strategic defeat for the Resistance. The discovery of Alfred's body in the Batcave struck Damian Wayne with the force of a physical blow. The young man's training having prepared him for many forms of loss and disappointment, yet providing no framework for processing the senseless destruction of someone whose kindness and wisdom had served as an anchor point in a life already complicated by divided loyalties and conflicting obligations. The blood that pooled around the butler's still form told a story of struggle and courage that no forensic investigation could adequately capture or honor. The rage that consumed Damian in the aftermath of Alfred's death was notable not merely for its intensity, but for its complete abandonment of the restraint and discipline that had once characterized his approach to combat. His enhanced strength, combining with emotional devastation, to create a capacity for destruction that exceeded anything he had previously demonstrated. The stone floor that cracked and crumbled under his fists provided inadequate outlet for grief and fury that demanded more substantial targets for their expression. The revelation that Superman had been directly responsible for Alfred's murder, whether through explicit orders or general policies that made such actions inevitable, shattered the last vestiges of moral ambiguity that had allowed some observers to view the conflict as a tragic disagreement between well-intentioned individuals rather than a clear-cut struggle between tyranny and freedom. The crossing of lines that had once seemed absolute created new categories of accountability and judgment that would reshape every subsequent interaction between the opposing forces. Victor Zayas's attempt to flee justice represented the kind of futile gesture that had once provided comic relief in conflicts between heroes and ordinary criminals. Yet the desperation that motivated his escape attempt spoke to genuine terror of consequences that would be neither swift nor merciful. The knowledge that his assassination of Alfred had been conducted on behalf of forces that possessed both the power and inclination to eliminate anyone who had outlived their usefulness transformed his situation from merely criminal to existentially terrifying. The pursuit through Gotham's streets was conducted with the methodical precision that Batman brought to all his operations. Yet the personal stakes involved in capturing Alfred's killer added emotional weight that threatened to overwhelm the tactical considerations that normally guided his actions. The batarangs that brought down the fleeing assassin were thrown with more force than necessary, their impact calculated to cause maximum pain while ensuring that the target remained conscious and capable of answering questions about his employers and their methods. The interrogation that followed in the abandoned alley revealed information that confirmed the Resistance's worst fears about the regime's willingness to employ any methods necessary to achieve their vision of perfect order. Yet it also provided tactical intelligence that might prove invaluable in planning future operations against targets whose security measures had previously seemed impenetrable. The knowledge that Superman himself had sanctioned the murder of an elderly servant created propaganda opportunities that could potentially shift public opinion against the regime. Damian's arrival at the interrogation scene created a confrontation that neither he nor his father were prepared to handle effectively. Their relationship having been strained beyond any easy repair by choices that had placed them on opposite sides of a conflict that admitted no neutral ground or comfortable compromises. The young man's demand for lethal justice reflected both his grief over Alfred's death and his broader philosophical alignment with Superman's utilitarian approach to problem-solving. The philosophical argument that erupted between father and son encapsulated many of the broader tensions that had torn apart the superhero community, competing visions of justice that could not be reconciled through rational discussion or appeals to shared values. Batman's defense of restraint and due process was met by Damian's cold calculation of the lives that would be saved through the elimination of dangerous criminals. Their debate conducted over the prone form of someone whose fate would be determined by whichever argument proved more convincing. The arrival of Superman and his forces at the scene transformed a family dispute into a tactical crisis that required immediate resolution through violence or negotiation. Yet the personal animosity between the participants made any form of peaceful settlement impossible to achieve. The sight of Victor Zayas attempting to capitalize on the distraction by escaping from custody provided a focus for collective action that temporarily interrupted the more complex conflicts between former friends and allies. The battle that followed was notable for its intimate and personal nature rather than its scale or cosmic implications. Former allies and family members finding themselves forced to employ their most devastating abilities against people whose psychological profiles they knew better than their own. Superman's heat vision, Wonder Woman's combat skills, Hal Jordan's constructs, and the Flash's superhuman speed were all brought to bear in a conflict that settled nothing while demonstrating how thoroughly their relationships had been poisoned by years of accumulated grievance and betrayal. Batman's use of the dumpster as an improvised weapon against Hal Jordan provided one of the few moments of tactical innovation in a battle otherwise characterized by straightforward applications of superior force. His strategic thinking remaining sharp, despite the emotional stress of fighting against people he had once considered family. The sight of the Green Lantern trapped beneath tons of metal refuse served as both practical victory and symbolic statement about the transformation of noble ideals into something resembling common criminality. Wonder Woman's challenge to Batman's accusations about her integrity revealed how thoroughly her Amazon training had been corrupted by years of serving someone whose vision of justice bore no resemblance to the principles that had once guided her heroic mission. The righteousness that had once motivated her protection of the innocent had been transformed into defensive anger at anyone who questioned the methods employed in service of what she still believed to be noble goals. The Flash's intervention to prevent Batman's capture demonstrated that some capacity for independent moral judgment still existed within the regime's ranks. Yet his actions also created complications that would reverberate through future operations on both sides of the conflict. The speed that allowed him to evacuate Batman from immediate danger also provided Superman with evidence of disloyalty among his closest allies, information that would influence strategic planning and personal relationships in ways that neither Barry Allen nor Bruce Wayne could fully anticipate. The conversation between Batman and the Flash that followed their escape revealed the depth of regret and moral confusion that characterized many of Superman's supporters. Their continued participation in increasingly authoritarian policies motivated more by inertia and fear than by genuine belief in the righteousness of their cause. The plea for time travel intervention as a solution to problems that conventional heroism had proven incapable of addressing spoke to desperation that transcended tactical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about fate, free will, and the possibility of redemption for choices that had already been made. The funeral that provided the ostensible reason for the Flash's assistance in Batman's escape served multiple purposes beyond honoring Alfred's memory and providing closure for those who had loved him, becoming also a rallying point for resistance members whose commitment to their cause had been shaken by years of defeat and compromise. The gathering of survivors from across the spectrum of opposition to Superman's regime created opportunities for coordination and mutual support that had been impossible to achieve through more conventional organizational methods. The irony that Alfred's birth certificate had been in Batman's possession for years yet never used to spoil the annual tradition of guessing his birthday provided a moment of bittersweet humor that served to humanize a conflict, increasingly characterized by abstract principles and cosmic stakes. The revelation that the butler had almost certainly known about Batman's knowledge while maintaining the pretense for the sake of their relationship demonstrated the kind of gentle wisdom that had made him invaluable not merely as a praeses servant, but as a moral anchor in lives shaped by extraordinary circumstances. The return of the Flash to the Hall of Justice created immediate complications for Superman's inner circle, his assistance to Batman requiring explanations that could not be provided without revealing the depth of his doubts about the regime's methods and ultimate goals. The physical confrontation that followed his admission of allowing Batman's escape demonstrated how thoroughly Superman's capacity for forgiveness had been eroded by years of betrayal and opposition, his treatment of former friends becoming indistinguishable from his handling of declared enemies. The scene at the bar where the Flash sought solace among ordinary humans provided insight into the psychological toll that years of moral compromise had exacted upon someone whose nature had once been characterized by optimism and faith in Kafir, the fundamental goodness of both heroes and the people they served. The conversation with a stranger who bore only superficial resemblance to Captain Cold served as a reminder that the war between Superman and Batman had isolated both sides from the normal human relationships that had once provided meaning and context for their extraordinary abilities. The death of Killer Shark during the Flash's intervention to save Iris represented the kind of accidental tragedy that had become commonplace in a world where former heroes were forced to make split-second decisions about the farm's application of lethal force, their enhanced abilities making even defensive actions potentially fatal to opponents whose capabilities were insufficient to survive contact with superhuman speed or strength. The knowledge that he had killed someone, even in defense of another, added psychological weight to burdens that were already threatening to crush his capacity for heroic action. The confrontation between the Flash and Iris revealed how thoroughly the conflict had penetrated every aspect of personal and professional relationships. Even marriages that had once seemed strong enough to survive any external pressure, proving vulnerable to the moral complexities that surrounded every aspect of life under Superman's regime. The accusation that Barry Allen had betrayed his own principles through inaction and complicity carried the weight of years of accumulated disappointment and frustrated hope for his moral awakening. The promise that Iris had extracted from her husband years earlier, his commitment to oppose Superman if the last son of Krypton ever chose the wrong path, served as both personal obligation and tactical opportunity for the resistance forces who understood that the Flash's defection could provide them with capabilities that had been absent from their operations since the early days of the conflict. Yet the psychological pressure required to transform Barry Allen from reluctant supporter to active opponent might destroy the very qualities that made his assistance valuable in the first place. The arrest of Iris and the other protesters provided Superman with propaganda opportunities that could be used to demonstrate the regime's commitment to law and order, while simultaneously serving as leverage against anyone who might be tempted to follow the Flash's example of moral awakening. The sight of ordinary citizens being processed through detention facilities designed for superpowered criminals created visual testimony to the transformation of protective measures into instruments of oppression that even the regime's most dedicated supporters found difficult to rationalize or defend. The final revelation that the war between Superman and Batman had reached its ultimate phase, with both sides preparing for operations whose success would require the sacrifice of everything they had once held sacred, served as prelude to conflicts that would test not merely their tactical capabilities but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe where gods walked among mortals and justice had become indistinguishable from the will of whoever possessed the power to enforce their vision of proper order. The final gambit that would determine the fate of human civilization began not with grand declarations or cosmic battles, but in the shadowed corners of abandoned warehouses and forgotten laboratories where desperate men gathered to construct miracles from desperation and genius. The alliance between Batman and Lex Luthor had been forged through necessity rather than trust. Their mutual recognition that conventional methods had proven inadequate to address a threat that transcended every category of opposition that either had previously encountered in their respective wars against injustice and ignorance. The mountain fortress in Indonesia, where Slade Wilson had chosen to spend what he understood would be his final days, was a testament to the philosophy that had guided his entire career. Its defenses designed not to repel all attackers, but to ensure that any victory achieved against him would come at a cost so terrible that rational enemies would choose different targets for their aggression. Yet the mission that Batman had brought to him transcended rational calculation, representing instead a suicidal gesture that appealed to whatever remained of honor and purpose in a soul that had been shaped by decades of warfare and moral compromise. Deathstroke's acceptance of the mission to infiltrate Star Labs and acquire the Mother Box technology was motivated not by hope for personal survival or even tactical success, but by recognition that some causes were worthy of sacrifice regardless of the mathematical probability of achieving meaningful results. The legendary mercenary who had once commanded premium rates for his services now found himself working without compensation for a cause that offered nothing except the opportunity to strike one final blow against enemies who had transformed heroism itself into an instrument of oppression. The cliffs that surrounded the Star Labs facility represented the kind of natural obstacle that would have deterred conventional infiltrators. Yet Slade's enhanced physiology and decades of experience with impossible missions allowed him to approach the target through vectors that the regime's security planners had dismissed as impractical. The darkness that concealed his ascent was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of shadows that seemed to bend around his form, as if the universe itself conspired to aid someone whose mission served purposes larger than personal advancement or survival. The guards who fell to Deathstroke's blades died without understanding why they had been targeted or what their deaths would accomplish, their training having prepared them for conventional threats rather than opponents whose skills had been refined through conflicts that spanned multiple continents and decades of professional evolution. The silence with which he moved through their positions was not merely tactical necessity, but artistic expression, each kill accomplished with the precision that separated master craftsmen from mere practitioners of violence. The storage facility that housed the Mother Box represented the culmination of humanity's attempts to understand and replicate technologies that operated according to principles that transcended their current scientific framework. Yet, the alien artifact's true significance extended far beyond its immediate tactical applications to encompass possibilities for dimensional manipulation that could reshape the fundamental structure of reality itself. The device that sat innocuously on its pedestal carried within its crystalline matrix the power to bridge gaps between worlds that existed in entirely different states of cosmic development. The arrival of Metamorpho at the storage facility created complications that Deathstroke's tactical planning had anticipated, yet hoped to avoid. The elemental being's unique abilities presenting challenges that conventional weapons and strategies could not adequately address. The battle that followed was conducted in 3 dimensions simultaneously, their conflict reshaping the laboratory around them as matter itself became a weapon in the hands of someone whose molecular structure existed in a state of controlled chaos. The conversation between these 2 enhanced beings revealed philosophical differences that transcended their immediate tactical situation. Metamorpho's genuine concern for the innocent lives that might be lost through Deathstroke's mission contrasting sharply with the mercenaries' cold calculation of acceptable casualties in service of strategic objectives. The accusation of excessive verbosity was delivered with the dry humor that had sustained Slade Wilson through decades of moral ambiguity. Yet it also reflected genuine frustration with opponents who insisted on discussing ethics during situations that demanded immediate action. The downloading of the Motherbox schematics was accomplished through technological interfaces that pushed the boundaries of what human engineering had achieved through reverse engineering of alien technologies. The data transfer requiring processing capabilities that existed at the absolute limits of terrestrial computer science. The information that flowed through quantum channels represented not merely technical specifications, but glimpses into cosmic principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and reality across dimensional boundaries that normal physics could not adequately describe. The arrival of Cyborg and Raven at the facility marked the escalation from covert infiltration to open warfare, their combined abilities representing the kind of overwhelming force that the regime typically employed when subtlety had proven insufficient to achieve desired objectives. The half-machine being whose consciousness existed partially in cybernetic systems, and the demonic sorceress whose powers drew upon interdimensional energy sources created a tactical combination that would have challenged even the most experienced military units. The transmission of complete technical data to Batman and Lex Luthor was accomplished in the final seconds before Deathstroke's capture became inevitable. his sacrifice ensuring that the Resistance would possess the information necessary to construct their own dimensional bridge regardless of what happened to the man who had made such knowledge possible. The acceptance of imprisonment and likely death was conducted with the same professional detachment that had characterized his entire career, yet beneath the surface lay satisfaction at having contributed meaningfully to a cause larger than personal advancement. The laboratory where Batman and Lex Luthor worked to construct their version of Mother Box technology from stolen specifications was a monument to human ingenuity applied to problems that exceeded every previous challenge they had faced, either individually or in collaboration. The fusion of Wayne Industries' advanced materials research with LexCorp's theoretical physics capabilities created possibilities for innovation that neither organization could have achieved independently, their combined expertise pushing the boundaries of what terrestrial science could accomplish through pure determination and intellectual brilliance. The reconstruction of Mother Box technology required not merely technical skill, but intuitive understanding of principles that operated beyond the normal boundaries of three-dimensional physics. The alien devices functioned depending upon quantum relationships that existed in states of superposition until observed by consciousness capable of resolving their paradoxes into actionable reality. The mathematics involved in describing such phenomena challenged even Lex Luthor's formidable intellect, requiring computational models that incorporated variables from multiple dimensions simultaneously. The monitoring of parallel universes had been conducted by Star Labs for years through methods that the general public would have found impossible to believe. Their detection of alternate realities serving both scientific curiosity and strategic planning for scenarios involving dimensional incursion or cosmic catastrophe. The database of alternate Earths that they had compiled contained detailed profiles of worlds where history had unfolded according to different patterns, some more hopeful than their own reality, and others far more terrible in their implications for human potential. The identification of a parallel universe where Superman had remained true to his original heroic principles required careful analysis of quantum resonance patterns that distinguished between realities where specific individuals had made different choices at crucial moments in their development. The world they selected as the source of potential allies was characterized by relationships and moral frameworks that mirrored their own realities past. Before tragedy and moral compromise had poisoned every institution that had once provided stability and meaning. The harvesting of Speed Force energy from the Flash's movements had been conducted without his knowledge or consent through methods that Lex Luthor had developed during his study of metahuman physiology. Microscopic collection devices embedded in the regime's infrastructure, gathering residual energy from Barry Allen's superhuman velocity and storing it in crystalline matrices designed to contain forces that existed partially outside normal space-time. The accumulated power represented years of covert activity, each mission the Flash had undertaken on Superman's behalf contributing to the very weapon that would eventually be used against the regime he served. The transformation of Speed Force energy into dimensional bridge power required theoretical breakthroughs that pushed human understanding of cosmic forces into realms that had previously been accessible only to beings like the New Gods or other entities whose existence transcended normal physical limitations. The equations that governed such transformations operated according to principles that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental force rather than an emergent property of complex matter, requiring the collaboration of multiple brilliant minds working in perfect synchronization. The parallel Earth that served as their target existed in a state of heroic innocence that their own world had lost years earlier, its Superman still committed to protection rather than control, its Batman still capable of friendship and trust, its Wonder Woman still guided by wisdom rather than blind loyalty to flawed leadership. The sight of these untainted heroes conducting themselves according to principles that seemed naive yet remained effective created psychological complications for observers whose own moral development had been shaped by harsher realities. The birthday celebration for Alfred Pennyworth in the parallel universe provided a moment of bittersweet recognition for those who observed it through dimensional viewing equipment. The sight of the elderly butler surrounded by friends and family who had been lost to their own timeline, serving as both inspiration and torment. The simple joy that characterized the gathering stood in stark contrast to the funeral that had marked Alfred's passing in their reality. His murder, transforming what should have been celebration into tragedy that would resonate through every subsequent development in their war. The Joker's plot in the parallel universe unfolded according to patterns that were simultaneously familiar and different. His targeting of Metropolis with nuclear weapons representing the same fundamental evil that had destroyed their own world, yet occurring in a context where heroic response remained possible rather than arriving too late to prevent catastrophe. The sight of heroes working together to prevent tragedy rather than seeking vengeance after its completion provided glimpses of roads not taken and possibilities that had been abandoned through choices that could never be undone. The interdimensional kidnapping of the Parallel Justice League was accomplished through methods that violated every principle of international law and moral philosophy that had once governed heroic conduct. Yet the desperate circumstances that motivated such extreme measures had transformed ethical absolutes into luxury items that the resistance could no longer afford. The motherbox technology that made such abduction possible operated by creating quantum tunnels between realities, allowing matter and energy to be transferred across dimensional boundaries that normally served as absolute barriers between different states of existence. The moments before the dimensional transfer were filled with confusion and disorientation as the parallel heroes found themselves confronting a situation that their previous experience had not prepared them to handle, their reality shifting without warning from familiar surroundings to environments that bore only superficial resemblance to the world they knew. The Joker's bomb plot that had been interrupted by the dimensional kidnapping remained suspended in quantum probability, its resolution dependent upon their eventual return to complete whatever heroic intervention had been initiated. The facility where the parallel heroes materialized was designed to contain beings whose power levels matched those of the regime's primary members. Its restraints and barriers incorporating every lesson that 5 years of conflict had taught about the specific vulnerabilities and requirements necessary to hold individuals whose capabilities exceeded normal human understanding. Yet the psychological impact of finding themselves imprisoned by versions of people they had considered friends and allies created confusion that transcended mere physical restraint. The parallel Superman's first encounter with his tyrannical counterpart was conducted through reinforced barriers that were necessary to prevent immediate violence between beings whose fundamental disagreement about the proper use of power could only be resolved through methods that might devastate entire continents. The contrast between their moral positions was made explicit through conversation that revealed how single moments of choice could reshape entire personalities, transforming protectors into oppressors through the alchemy of grief and unchecked power. The parallel Batman's analysis of their situation was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized his work in every reality. Yet his conclusions were shaped by experiences that had never included the systematic betrayal of trust and erosion of principle that had marked his alternate self's development. The strategic assessments he provided to his fellow captives reflected assumptions about heroic cooperation and moral reliability that seemed almost childishly optimistic to observers who had witnessed the transformation of noble intentions into instruments of tyranny. Catwoman's approach to Superman with an offer that would end the conflict through betrayal of Batman's location represented the culmination of years of moral erosion and personal desperation. Her decision to abandon the resistance motivated not by philosophical conversion to the regime's principles, but by simple exhaustion, with a war that had claimed too many lives while achieving no meaningful progress toward victory or Resolution. The intelligence she provided about Batman's secret base was accurate and complete, her knowledge of his operations making her betrayal particularly devastating. The final preparations at Batman's hidden stronghold were conducted with the knowledge that discovery and assault were inevitable. The advanced defensive systems and emergency protocols representing final gestures of defiance rather than genuine hopes for survival against enemies whose capabilities had been demonstrated too many times to permit any illusions about the six. Outcome of direct confrontation. The men and women who worked alongside Batman understood that they were participating in history's final chapter, their actions serving symbolic rather than tactical purposes. The arrival of Batgirl and Batwoman at the base created complications that their contingency planning had not adequately anticipated. Barbara Gordon's restored mobility and Kate Kane's military expertise providing capabilities that might prove crucial during the transition phase when dimensional technology would be most vulnerable to disruption. Their decision to participate despite the obvious dangers reflected the kind of courage that had once characterized all heroic endeavors, yet their presence also added emotional weight to decisions that required cold calculation rather than sentiment. The malfunction of the interdimensional equipment caused by Superman's heat vision attack forced manual operation of systems that had been designed for automated control, their backup procedures requiring sacrifices that none of the participants were prepared to make, yet all understood to be inevitable. The sight of Kate Kane preparing to integrate herself directly into the energy field demonstrated the transformation of theoretical heroism into practical martyrdom, her military training having taught her to accept death as an acceptable price for mission success. The final moments before the dimensional transfer were filled with desperate activity, as multiple parties attempted to prevent or ensure the completion of procedures that would reshape the fundamental balance of power in their Taitian conflict. Superman's arrival at the base representing both tactical disaster and strategic opportunity for forces whose planning had incorporated every possible contingency except the possibility of actual success. The sight of the parallel Justice League appearing in their reality marked the beginning of the end of the war that had consumed their world for 5 years of increasingly desperate conflict between competing visions of what heroism should mean. When gods walked among mortals and justice became indistinguishable from the will of whoever possessed sufficient power to enforce their personal vision of proper order upon a universe that had never asked for such intervention. The convergence of two realities that had never been intended to coexist created phenomena that challenged every assumption about the stability of dimensional barriers and the fundamental laws that governed the relationship between immersive, parallel versions of the same universe. The moment when the heroic Justice League materialized in a world where their counterparts had become instruments of oppression rather than protection marked not merely the beginning of the final battle, but the collision of incompatible moral frameworks that could not occupy the same space without one completely destroying the other. The parallel Superman who found himself confronting his tyrannical alternate emerged from the dimensional portal with the same unwavering confidence that had characterized every heroic intervention of his career. Yet the reality he encountered bore such disturbing resemblance to his own world that initial confusion was inevitable. The familiar geography of Metropolis, the recognizable faces of former allies, the technological marvels that should have represented hope and progress, all had been transformed into instruments of control that served purposes antithetical to everything he had dedicated his existence to protecting and preserving. The first words exchanged between the two supermen carried weight that transcended their immediate tactical situation to encompass fundamental questions about identity, moral responsibility, and the price of power wielded without adequate restraint or wisdom. The heroic version's horror at witnessing what his alternate had become was matched only by the tyrannical Superman's defensive anger at being judged by someone whose moral certainty had never been tested by the kind of losses that had reshaped his understanding of justice and necessity. The parallel Batman's assessment of their situation was conducted with the analytical precision that had made him effective in every reality where he existed. Yet his conclusions were shaped by experiences that included successful collaboration with Superman rather than the systematic betrayal and philosophical corruption that had poisoned the relationship in this darker timeline. His immediate recognition of the strategic implications of their dimensional displacement demonstrated tactical thinking unclouded by the accumulated trauma and moral compromise that had transformed his alternate into something resembling a terrorist rather than a protector. The emergence of the parallel Wonder Woman from the dimensional portal brought with it not merely additional firepower for the heroic cause, but also a mirror that reflected how thoroughly the Amazon princess of this reality had been. Corrupted by loyalty to someone whose transformation she had witnessed yet failed to prevent or oppose effectively. The contrast between divine wisdom properly applied and noble intentions twisted by misguided devotion created psychological complications that transcended tactical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of friendship and the obligations that came with witnessing moral degradation in those one claimed to love. The parallel Flash, whose speed had never been employed in service of authoritarian enforcement operations, retained the optimism and fundamental decency that had been gradually eroded from his alternate through years of complicity in increasingly questionable actions, his presence serving as both tactical asset and moral reproach to Barry Allen, whose cooperation with the regime had been purchased through rationalizations that seemed pathetic when confronted with evidence of what he might have remained under different circumstances. The battle that erupted around Batman's compromised stronghold represented more than mere combat between opposing forces, becoming instead a physical manifestation of the philosophical war between different interpretations of what it meant to possess extraordinary abilities in a universe filled with ordinary people whose welfare depended upon the choices made by their self-appointed protectors. Every blow exchange carried the weight of competing visions of heroism, different understandings of whether gods should rule mortals or serve them, conflicting definitions of justice that could be resolved only through the complete defeat of one side or the other. Superman's assault on the facility that had served as Batman's final refuge was conducted with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized all his interventions since his transformation from protector to ruler. His heat vision and superhuman strength employed not merely to achieve tactical objectives, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against forces that operated beyond the normal limitations of human ambition or technological capability. The walls that crumbled before his advance had been constructed from materials designed to withstand any conventional assault, yet their destruction served as visual testimony to the obsolescence of all barriers when confronted by will backed by unlimited power. The sacrifice of Batwoman to activate the dimensional portal represented the kind of heroic gesture that had once defined the difference between heroes and ordinary people. Her willingness to accept death in service of principles larger than personal survival, demonstrating that some capacity for nobility still existed even in a world where such qualities had been systematically devalued and discouraged by authorities who preferred compliance to conscience. The energies that consumed her physical form were both terrible and beautiful, her final moments illuminated by forces that existed at the intersection of science and magic. The arrival of the parallel Justice League in the corrupted reality created immediate tactical complications for Superman's forces. Their assumptions about the capabilities and limitations of their opponents suddenly rendered obsolete by the presence of beings who possessed identical powers yet operated according to entirely different moral frameworks. The confusion that marked the initial exchanges of combat was gradually replaced by grim recognition that this conflict would require the expenditure of resources and capabilities that neither side had previously been forced to employ, against opponents whose nature they understood so intimately. The parallel Superman's first direct confrontation with his tyrannical counterpart was conducted at velocities that created sonic booms across multiple continents. Their movement through Earth's atmosphere, generating phenomena that would be detected by seismic monitoring stations and attributed to unusual tectonic activity rather than combat between beings whose existence challenged every point for assumption about the limits of biological possibility. The conversation they conducted while trading blows at superhuman speeds revealed philosophical differences that made their conflict inevitable regardless of any external circumstances that might have brought them together. The heroic Superman's horror at witnessing the transformation of Metropolis into a monument to authoritarian efficiency was evident in every word and gesture. His inability to comprehend how loss could justify the systematic elimination of freedom and dignity, creating psychological vulnerabilities that his alternate was prepared to exploit without mercy or restraint. The argument that grief was no excuse for tyranny was met with cold recitation of casualty statistics and crime reduction data, utilitarian calculations that reduced human complexity to mathematical equations whose solutions justified any methodology that achieved desired results. The parallel Batman's infiltration of the regime's command structure was accomplished through methods that his darker alternate would have recognized and appreciated under different circumstances. The heroic version's detective skills having been honed through years of cooperation with Superman, rather than opposition that required constant vigilance against betrayal and surveillance. His analysis of the regime's weaknesses was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all his work. Yet his recommendations were shaped by assumptions about redemption and rehabilitation that seemed naive to observers who had witnessed the systematic corruption of every institution they had once trusted. The psychological warfare conducted between the parallel heroes and their corrupted alternates revealed layers of complexity that transcended simple good versus evil narratives to encompass questions about the relationship between circumstances and character, the role of choice in moral development, and the possibility that anyone might become something monstrous given sufficient pressure and inadequate support systems. The parallel Wonder Woman's attempts to reach her alternate through appeals to their shared Amazonian heritage were met with defensive anger that concealed profound shame about choices that could never be undone or adequately justified. The regime's response to the dimensional incursion involved the deployment of weapons and strategies that had been developed specifically for use against opponents whose capabilities matched those of Superman and his allies. Their advanced technology and tactical sophistication, representing years of preparation for conflicts that conventional military doctrine could not adequately address. The sight of former heroes employing methods designed to kill rather than capture demonstrated how thoroughly their understanding of acceptable limits had been reshaped by participation in a system that recognized no authority beyond its own will. The civilian population's reaction to witnessing two versions of their world's greatest heroes engaged in mortal combat created propaganda opportunities that both sides attempted to exploit. Yet, the complexity of the situation defied easy categorization or simple emotional responses. The sight of a heroic Superman fighting against the figure they had been conditioned to view as their protector created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority and legitimacy. While the obvious moral superiority of the parallel heroes provided hope that some observers had believed permanently extinguished, the involvement of the parallel Flash in rescue operations designed to minimize civilian casualties during the superhuman combat created tactical complications for the regime's forces while simultaneously providing evidence of heroic priorities that had been absent from their reality for 5 years. The speed that Barry Allen employed in service of Superman's authoritarian agenda was matched and exceeded by an alternate who used identical capabilities to protect innocent bystanders rather than eliminate political opposition. The contrast highlighting choices that had been made and possibilities that had been abandoned. The battle between the parallel Green Lantern and his corrupted alternate revealed the extent to which Hal Jordan's moral compromise had weakened his connection to the power source that should have been strengthened by righteous purpose, the yellow ring that he wore serving as both weapon and symbol of his fall from grace. The constructs created by will, corrupted by fear, proved inferior to those generated by genuine heroic determination. Their combat serving as object lesson about the relationship between moral clarity and effective application of cosmic forces. The emergence of the Joker from the parallel universe into the corrupted reality created complications that neither side had anticipated or prepared for adequately, his presence serving as catalyst for events that would reshape the fundamental nature of their conflict. The Clown Prince of Crime, whose nuclear plot had been interrupted by dimensional displacement, found himself in a world where his greatest joke had already been successfully implemented. The twisted satisfaction he derived from witnessing the consequences of his alternate's actions, revealing psychological depths that challenged every assumption about the nature of evil and responsibility. The parallel Joker's analysis of the regime's methods was conducted with the clinical detachment of someone whose insanity provided unique perspectives on the relationship between order and chaos. His observations about the transformation of heroism into tyranny carrying insights that were simultaneously profound and disturbing. The suggestion that Superman's New World Order represented the ultimate expression of his own anarchic philosophy, albeit through methods that prioritized control over chaos, created philosophical paradoxes that neither side could adequately address through conventional reasoning. The corruption of children who had been raised under the regime's educational system was revealed through their reactions to witnessing actual heroism rather than the systematic oppression that had been presented to them as protection and justice. The parallel hero's attempts to inspire hope and courage in young people who had been taught that such emotions were dangerous luxuries that threatened social stability demonstrated the long-term psychological damage inflicted by authoritarian governance, even when it was implemented with supposedly benevolent intentions. The technological marvels that had been developed to support the regime's global surveillance and control systems proved inadequate when deployed against opponents who possessed intimate knowledge of their capabilities yet operated according to moral frameworks that rendered such knowledge irrelevant to tactical planning. The parallel Batman's ability to predict and counter systems designed by his alternate self demonstrated the fundamental importance of psychological understanding in any conflict between opponents whose capabilities were otherwise evenly matched. The revelation that Lex Luthor had been serving as double agent throughout the conflict provided the parallel heroes with intelligence about the regime's vulnerabilities and strategic planning that proved invaluable in coordinating their resistance efforts. Yet it also raised questions about the reliability of allies whose motivations remained opaque even to those who benefited from their assistance. The industrialist's complex relationship with both versions of Superman created opportunities for manipulation that transcended simple loyalty to encompass personal agenda that might conflict with broader strategic objectives. The philosophical debates that occurred during brief lulls in the combat revealed the extent to which the regime's supporters had convinced themselves that their methods were justified by results. Their utilitarian calculations about lives saved versus freedoms lost, creating moral frameworks that appeared logical yet violated fundamental principles about human dignity and the right to self-determination. The parallel hero's arguments about the intrinsic value of liberty and the dangers of paternalistic governance were met with statistics about crime reduction and economic efficiency that reduced complex social questions to both mathematical equations. The involvement of ordinary citizens in the conflict, whether as targets for protection or sources of intelligence and support, demonstrated that the war between competing visions of heroism could not be contained within the superhuman community, but inevitably involved everyone whose lives were affected by the choices made by those who possessed extraordinary feating capabilities. The courage shown by resistance members who possessed no special powers yet continued to oppose overwhelming force provided examples of heroism that transcended physical capability to encompass moral determination and refusal to surrender. Principles regardless of consequences. The systematic destruction of the regime's command and control infrastructure by coordinated attacks from the parallel heroes and surviving resistance members created opportunities for popular uprising that had been suppressed for years by the omnipresent threat of superhuman retaliation against dissent. The sight of ordinary people reclaiming institutions that had been transformed into instruments of oppression demonstrated that the foundation of any legitimate government must rest upon the consent of the governed rather than the acquiescence of the intimidated. The final confrontation between the two supermen took place in the ruins of what had once been the Hall of Justice, its symbolism providing appropriate backdrop for a battle that would determine whether the principles it had originally represented could be restored or were permanently corrupted by the choices that had transformed it from sanctuary into seat of authoritarian power. The building that crumbled around them as they fought had been constructed to honor ideals that one of them had abandoned while the other had never been forced to question, their combat serving as both physical and philosophical struggle for the soul of heroism itself. The moment when the tyrannical Superman finally acknowledged the horror of what he had become was marked not by dramatic gesture or climactic revelation, but by quiet recognition of truths that his grief and anger had concealed from his soaked, conscious mind for 5 years of escalating moral compromise. The tears that fell from eyes that had witnessed the systematic destruction of everything he had once sworn to protect carried weight that transcended individual tragedy to encompass the possibility that redemption might remain achievable, even for those who had traveled farthest from the light. The restoration of hope to a world that had learned to fear its former protectors would require more than military victory or the elimination of authoritarian institutions, demanding instead the patient work of rebuilding trust and demonstrating through consistent action that power could be employed in service of others rather than in pursuit of personal vision, however noble its original intentions might have been. The parallel heroes whose intervention had made victory possible understood that their greatest challenge would not be defeating the regime, but healing the psychological wounds inflicted by years of systematic betrayal of heroic ideals. The dawn that broke over a world where freedom had been restored through sacrifice and determination carried with it possibilities that had seemed permanently extinguished, yet also responsibilities that would test whether the lessons learned through 5 years of tyranny could prevent future repetitions of the same tragic pattern. The heroes who remained, both parallel and native to the restored reality, faced the monumental task of proving that extraordinary power could coexist with democratic governance and individual liberty, their success or failure determining whether the sacrifice of those who had died in service of resistance would ultimately prove meaningful or merely postpone inevitable repetition of humanity's oldest and most dangerous folly. And so concludes this chronicle of a world where hope became despair, where protection became oppression, where the brightest light cast the darkest shadows. In witnessing Superman's fall from grace and Batman's desperate struggle to preserve what remained of justice, we see reflected the eternal questions that define heroism itself. What happens when the protectors need protection from themselves? How thin is the line between saving the world and ruling it? The injustice timeline serves as a mirror to our own understanding of power, responsibility, and the choices that define us in our darkest hours. In Superman's tragedy, we find not a villain's origin story, but a cautionary tale about grief unchecked, power without restraint, and the dangerous seduction of believing that the ends always justify the means. As you drift into peaceful slumber, remember that in every universe where heroes fall, there exists the possibility of redemption, the chance for new heroes to rise, and the eternal truth that even in the darkest timeline, hope endures in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender their humanity to expedience or despair. Sweet dreams, guardian of infinite possibilities.